Hey!
Hey, everybody. Yeah, hello, welcome to every Saturday a stream number. What number is this? 12. I almost remembered. Keyword almost. So, yeah, welcome. We're going to be continuing on with this Bloodborne video thingy that we're doing. And one thing that I am going to mention now is that the next ESAS for next Saturday, I'm going to be busy, but I'm going to pre-record another video going over this video. So look out for that next Saturday. But yeah. And as you can tell, I got some sound effects going.
Hey!
And it's pretty funny. And
Bruh.
I got quite a lot here. I got a nice selection of things.
No!
Yes, I especially look forward to playing this one.
What?
Yeah, that one's going to be fun. That one's going to be fun. But anyway, let's get into this here video. One little thing to remember is this is going to be long running, extremely long running, and we're going at the pace that we can handle. So I've thought about kind of combining these on the ESAS backup, or not the backup, but the archive channel, and try to make a sort of a big video out of all this, which probably won't happen because it'll just be too fucking long. But it'll probably get its own dedicated playlist because of how fucking long it's taking to get through this thing. But anyway, let's get right into the Bloodborns. We just finished the Forbidden Wood section, and him talking about how he likes grass over all the other healing methods. So we'll see how this goes moving forward.
And this is why Bloodborne veering away from Estes is very interesting to me. It's almost like an acknowledgement that the healing system should be designed around the game rather than the other way around. And because the player can buy vials in the Hunter's Dream, and because healing is now attached to the combat, going back to depletable resources for healing makes a lot of sense to me. I understand if you don't like it, but if we had Estes here, then players would not be forced to desperately lean on.
I already made a lot of points about this sort of section he's talking about in the previous stream I did, but I do want to go back and highlight one thing. This is one thing I forgot to mention.
Very interesting to me. It's almost like an acknowledgement that the healing system should be designed around the game rather than the other way around. And because the player can buy vials in the Hunter's Dream, and because healing is now attached to the combat.
Healing is now attached to the combat, as opposed to every other fucking game before this where the healing was not tied to the combat. Just wanted to preface that. Just wanted to highlight that little section of words that he used there. Little weird. All I'm saying, little weird.
Going back to depletable resources for healing.
Anyway,
if we
skip a little bit forward because we already went through some of this.
Give the player the feeling of fighting for their life, producing that, and going back to NPCs.
Should be about
because
here,
we have no incentive
outside
of runes, badges, and early game items to engage with any of the NPCs.
Yeah, here we go.
We just aren't going to engage with them as much, and it's going to seem like Bloodborne is lacking in this department, even though it has about 25 NPCs, not counting the Blood Minister from the beginning, the NPCs who stay indoors or any summons. Now, Dark Souls had an excess of 40 and Demon Souls around 30, so yes, there is just a numeric deficiency in how many characters we can talk to, but more interactions, more incentives to talk to the ones we have here might have gone a long way to make that up, considering how many NPCs in the previous games were one-and-done affairs. I wonder if us being able to actually meet the Arnamites who stay indoors would make the world feel a bit livelier. And I also think that, in general, it would have been nice to have had some more passive NPCs or just some minor quests, like an NPC who gives you some fire paper if you clear out some enemies in an area so that they can go back home or something.
That is one thing that I do think could help flesh out the world even more than they like. I think they already do a really good job of fleshing out the world in these games, but I think it would be kind of cool if you had sort of minor NPCs, ones that aren't necessarily like they don't have a super long quest line. It's kind of like a one and done sort of thing, like sort of like minor quests in like any sort of like RPG game, where it's kind of like, hey, clear this area of these enemies or defeat this boss, and here's a little reward. Something simple that could be fun. Although it is a thing where that's very, very low on the rung of. It's very low on the list of priorities for a game, right? Because normally what you want for a game is, you make sure the mechanics work, you make sure the concept works, you make sure this isn't in any particular order, but it's like the most important things are: does the game work the way it should? Is it consistent? Does it work? Do all the textures work? Do all the physical aspects of combat work and all this other shit? Having little extra mini quest lines like that, or not even quest lines, just little one objective quests would be cool. But it is a thing where, given all the work they put into these things, I'm kind of okay if they just don't include something like that, if it means that we get more refined things that are more important.
From Software's worlds are celebrated for the sense of desolation they can impart onto the player, and since they all take place around some central law of the world getting twisted, there's always a really deep sense of societal collapse and the horrors which ensue after that. That being said, environmental storytelling, I think, only goes so far, and what we saw in Dark Souls with wandering NPCs, I think was a winning formula, which I would have liked to see somewhat expanded on here rather than reduced. And it's not even the raw numbers that I'm talking about. Sure, Dark Souls had more NPCs on the overworld to meet than Bloodborne does, but I don't think it was the number of NPCs which made people like them in Dark Souls. Rather, I think it was the way they breathed life into the world, and for Bloodborne to not capitalize on this by scripting out more engaging stories through the world is very disappointing. What I'm about to say will date this video, but if there are
That is one thing I fully agree with, right? Like I pretty fully agree with is it's kind of like the way you use NPCs is more important than the number of them. And that's one reason why Solaire is kind of like one of the most popular NPCs in From Software's catalog, along with kind of Patches, right? Now, granted, Patches appears throughout every single fucking game, but he kind of gets to cheat. But Solaire is super popular, because his quest line is really, not only is it useful and interesting in terms of mechanically where he chooses where he appears to help you, but also how he interacts with and his personality and sort of his kind of descent into realizing that everything's gone to shit, and especially when you get towards the end, when he kind of falls, when he gets basically, when you have to kill him, right? Or when he gets taken over by the Sunlight Maggot. That's the thing that takes that jolly cooperative friend you had throughout most of the game up to that point and just kind of breaks your heart with it. It's just like, oh, I lost my best friend in this game.
on this by scripting out more engaging stories through the world is very disappointing. What I'm about to say will date this video, but if there are two things I would really like to see from Elden Ring, it would be for healing to be a means of propping up the experience rather than sating the appetite of the fans who don't like.
Wait, hold on a minute. Okay, I want to back that up because I the way he started that point, I know I didn't let him finish, but like the way he started that just makes me question things. So let's get that full point.
About
again.
to say will date this video, but if there are two things I would really like to see from Elden Ring, it would be for healing to be a means of propping up the experience rather than sating the appetite of the fans who don't like anything but Estes. And
What? So you basically want something to stick it to the Estes Bros. Is that really the only point that like he? Let me go back to this. I'm trying to give the full point context just so people can understand it when I say something.
If there are two things I would really like to see from Elden Ring, it would be for healing to be a means of propping up the experience rather than sating the appetite of the fans who don't like anything but Estes.
Okay, so that's his entire point. Is he wants a system that props up the healing, or props up the system, rather than just being something for the Estes boys. It's like, could you have worded that a little bit more diplomatically than basically like, because if you break that down, right, it's basically saying I want a healing system that's not for the Estes people. That's basically what it says, right? Like, you don't have to read into that to pick that up, right? And it's just one of those things where, man, I hope you got what you wanted with Estes, because you didn't get it, right? They still kept the Flask system because the Flask system is consistent, works well, and with the changes that they made to it with Dark Souls 3 and moving forward with Elden Ring, I think it's a pretty well balanced system, given everything that these Souls games do nowadays. But anyway, let's see what his next point is.
And for it to lean more on character interactions as a way of propping up the experience rather than combat. And
Oh my god, it's all this vague stuff that, like, I have to interpret what he's saying. Oh man, this is one of those things that's like, sometimes you don't understand what you're saying until after you've kind of heard yourself say it a few times and you've gotten like a different perspective on it. Like, after reading comments in several of my commentaries, I've seen people that, kind of, they misunderstand what I mean, but the way I said it was a little confusing to begin with, right? Or it wasn't worded to get my full point across, and that's one thing that you'd think you'd learn when you make videos like he's making, where he gets like several hundred thousands of views. Right? I mean, like, look at me. I'm just a little shit with a computer. But it is a thing where, just like, the way you word things is very important. And sometimes I think it's very rare to get a point across accurately unless you script it. Otherwise, I think you're just incredibly gifted with speaking if you can get your entire point across the exact way you want it in words going forward, right? But like, without any like loopholes or possible misinterpretations. But it's just one of those things where what he said there with the healing and what he said there with the NPCs are things that you can kind of read into it into different ways if you want to, but at the baseline, they sort of mean a basic thing, right? And this is one thing that I think some people don't like about discussions amongst the community of these games, is that oftentimes it kind of devolves into this: you say you want something, but you say it in a nebulous sort of way where you don't actually explain specifically what you want, right? And that's one thing that I've had a problem with dealing with people in this community, that kind of talk like that, right? And I think it's a running problem with discussions about games in general, art in general, but more specifically with games. It's just, people can tell. It's like people can tell when they don't like something or when they do like something, but they can't really explain why. Like they just can't make that final like connection to make the wires work. But they have their basic feeling, but they can't put logic behind why they feel the way they do. You know. But anyway, not saying that they are illogical. I'm just saying that they can't make that connection sometimes. And I've had that. Like, we all have brain fart moments like that where you can't get the wires to work, for whatever reason. But anyway, let's go back and hear this point again, because I think he's about to elaborate on it.
like anything but Estes. And for it to lean more on character interactions as a way of propping up the experience rather than combat. And it
Okay, so that's one thing that I get what he's saying about the character interaction propping up the experience rather than the combat, but I would ask him to elaborate, because what does he mean when he says it this way, right? Because he's drawing whether intentionally or not, he's drawing a comparison between the NPC interactions, how that interfaces sort of with the game experience, along with how the combat mixes with the experience as well. He has drawn a connection between the two, or a comparison between the two. And I would ask him, what do you mean? Because you can have NPCs in these games that help you through different sort of experiences, right? And this is something that's happened throughout all the games. I don't know about Sekiro. I, again, haven't beat Sekiro. Don't know much about Sekiro other than a couple of basic things. But the whole thing with the NPCs was something that I think would I think it's a variable that From Software doesn't quite know how to handle. Even after Elden Ring, I don't think they quite know how to handle in terms of having NPCs take part in special events in these games, right? Because when you look at the way NPCs interact in the game, they're usually very, very limited. They're very limited to a specific boss encounter, for example, when you summon them, or it's a very specific interaction in a very specific area. Like, for example, Eileen, when you go back to Gascoigne's arena and she's fighting Henrik, right? When they're fighting, that is a very unique NPC interaction because it's an NPC fighting something that you come across them doing without having to summon them or engage in a boss fight yourself. It's something where they're doing shit and you're kind of there with them, right? Or you're there to instigate what's going on, right? It's not as, it's one of those things where it's a set piece pretty much. It's two hunters fighting in a boss arena without a boss there, right? That's kind of like, it's basically a set piece, of one hunter hunting another one, right? And the thing that I'm kind of leading to with all this is that From Software, after playing Elden Ring a lot, is I think From Software has a problem in terms of sort of where the ceiling of difficulty needs to be with their games after Elden Ring, because one common complaint about Elden Ring that I've seen in different videos and things is that people complain about the end game difficulty being a little ridiculous, and I'm very much in that boat. Like, I think the end game difficulty is a little bit ridiculous because you've got a lot of enemies that kind of sort of fight the same near the end, where their aesthetic may be different, but functionally their attacks are very similar in nature. You have a lot of AoE spam, you have a lot of extended combos, you have a whole bunch of delayed attacks. Just a lot of attacks that deal incredible damage, have incredible reach, and require you to spend an incredible amount of time to dodge them appropriately, right? And it's one of those things where I would wonder what, kind of tying it back to this Bloodborne video, what does Acer Aesthetics mean when he says he wants NPCs to be more of a way to prop up the experience rather than the combat? Because, but by saying it that way, like let's go back and get the full thing again.
Like anything but Estes. And for it to lean more on character interactions as a way of propping up the experience rather than combat.
Yeah, interactions. Yeah, propping up the experience rather than the combat, and it's like a thing where it's one of those things where you can kind of interpret that in different ways. Like, if you wanted to be sort of conservative with it, he could simply be saying that he would like more NPC interactions in the game, right? Which, to an extent, Elden Ring does have a little bit more consistency with that, just because you run into a lot more NPCs in the game, just because there are a lot more people to interact with, even though they're a little bit replaceable, or even though they're pretty much replaceable. Like all of the merchants that you acquire, that you meet across the lanes between. There's a ton of them out there, but they don't really function that differently, apart from some of the things they say here and there. Like, they're not full on different NPCs as much as they are just sort of one of a tribe that has a similar sort of sad backstory, right? And it's a thing where I understand where he's coming from with wanting to have more NPC interactions that kind of inform you of the world and take you on sort of a journey through the world, right? And this is one thing where I think what he meant to say was that he wants NPC interactions. He wants, what I think he was trying to say, instead of saying NPC interactions that add to the experience, besides the combat, or as opposed to the combat, I think what he meant to say was he would like more NPC interactions so that we could have more in terms of the content in the game besides the combat itself, right? And I think that's something that I think some people could definitely point at these series as, in terms of the main thing that you do in these games, it is the combat, it is the fighting, it is the, fight, die, get better, repeat sort of a thing. And while the NPC interactions in these games, I think, are I'd say they're a fairly, I'd say they go from from bad to good to great. Most of the time they're good. You get a couple of bad ones, but you also get a couple of great ones. But I do think it is a thing where I would like for him to elaborate on his point, because it sounds like he wants more NPC interactions in the world that do more than just talk to a person. But then you'd end up having to have that affect the combat in some way, because if you have NPCs that come with you or you encounter them a lot more, they're going to take up a lot more time, right? And depending on how that's implemented, you either spend more time talking to NPCs than you did in previous releases, or they actually have some sort of function where they're telling you stuff or leading you to do stuff in the game while also fighting alongside you, in which case you're going to have to adjust the difficulty according to that, right? And it's one of those things that it kind of opens a can of worms in terms of how are you going to balance NPC interactions where you don't spend hours just talking to people in between doing things versus having NPCs that actually tag along with you for a journey. Because I think that second thing, like having NPCs that tag along with you, I think is actually an interesting idea. The problem is how do they implement it? Because a lot of the times whenever you have multiple sort of friendlies, I guess is the best way to put it. Whenever you have multiple friendlies in the game tries to adjust the combat accordingly by giving the enemies more health and and or limiting the supplies of the help that you get. Just look at the average online functionality across these games, right? You get, when you join a world, you have reduced healing options when you're being summoned in, and the enemies have more health, right? It's a way to try. It's a very simple way to try to balance the combat against, the fact that there are more friendly people to aid the main player in beating the scenario, right? But it's one of those things where they really got to work on how to balance that, because it's very cheap, for lack of a better word. It's very cheap to just go, okay, new player in, okay, have their healing options double the boss's health. It's like, really, you couldn't think of a better way to deal with that. But it is one thing too where I think just multiplayer in these games in general is just something that is just not well optimized. I think it could be optimized a lot better. But that's neither here nor there. Let's get back to the video.
And it's not like this would be some radical new step for FromSoft. They've been hovering around this since Dark Souls 1 released and introduced us to covenants. Covenants are one of those things the FromSoft community seems to overwhelmingly agree on to have never been fully realized. These
covenants have never been fully realized. Let's go back.
Overwhelmingly agree on
get that whole point.
To have never been fully realized. These games are fairly unrestricted on the player's actions minute to minute. Yes, you are going down pre-designed gauntlets, but I mean in the sense that prior to Sekiro, the core gameplay is never altered for the sake of the story. There's no point where the player's walking speed is reduced to hammer home that the scene in front of them is important and that their desire to get to the end of it is secondary to Miyazaki's desire that they breathe it all in. Moment to moment, the player is in the driver's seat. Once they get their hands on the controller, it's a straight shot from one end of the map to the other, bar some short cutscenes and loading screens here and there. I've talked a lot about how From uses level design, area-specific challenges to vary up the experience and to direct the player a bit. But in terms of NPC interactions and utilizing them to breathe life into the world, Covenants are Miyazaki's red-headed stepchild in that he puts them in his game, but they are relegated solely to the online experience and to de-aggroing those NPCs in the forest in Dark Souls in the offline game.
I mean, I think I get where he's coming from with this, right? Because covenants are sort of an online focused sort of mechanic in the games, but at the same time, there are advantages to taking part in covenants outside of online play. For example, all the special items that you get from covenants by joining them and by ranking up in them. Dark Souls 1 is a fantastic example of that, right? You get several rewards at different tiers of different covenants, right? And each covenant has different sort of requirements in terms of how you interact with them, how you level up in them, and how much you can do within a new game cycle without like invading, right? Like I tackled that when I was doing achievement hunting for the Dark Souls trilogy to get all the achievements, right? In order to get some of those things, you have to farm Covenant stuff, and the best way to do that offline is just to play the game, find the specific spots that drop those items, and then just farm it, like just new game plus it over and over and over, over and over and over, or try to or try to find enemies that drop them and have some sort of percentage chance to drop them, right? Like Covenants as a whole, I think definitely could be expanded upon, but they aren't as one-dimensional as he is sort of making them appear at first glance, right? They obviously are meant to be sort of an online-focused thing, but they do have, sort of non-online aspects to them that can be advantageous, right? Especially when you look at Dark Souls 1, right? The Bed of Chaos shortcut, right? Through, I forget what that area is called in Lost Islet. That's basically just like you take the elevator down from Quilana, and then you just drop down, and then there's that shortcut past the slidey door where Solaire questline ends if it's bad, Yeah, it's like Dark Lurker and DS2 is access through a PvE only Covenant that has no online use. It's like, Covenants might be focused online, but they're not solely mechanically viable for online, and that's kind of the point, And also like one thing that I do like about different Covenants in different games is how they interact with the world in that particular sort of scenario offline, right? Because it makes it, more interesting in the world, whenever you can do something that affects the world in some way. Either you get an NPC quest line that deals with the Covenant, or you get a Covenant reward item that is really useful against some specific type of enemy. But just let's go back a little bit. I'm trying to give as much context to each of his points as possible without reviewing his entire freaking discography.
It's solely to the online experience and to de-aggroing those NPCs in the forest in Dark Souls in the offline game. Covenants, on paper, enable more guided experiences without placing arbitrary limits on the player's ability to engage with the world. Joining one gives players a certain obligation, and fulfilling those comes with certain rewards. As it relates to multiplayer, this mostly translates to killing other players or aiding them. And the reason Covenants always have a sort of number cap is because too many would fragment the online community and make it harder for players to meet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the last point he just made is like the Covenant's fragmenting the online community. That wouldn't technically be true. It depends on how they make the Covenants interact with each other online, right? Yeah, like, as you said, Andrew, it's like the DS3 was really good about interactable, like Covenants that are deeper than just go here if you're online and get like a spell or something. Like there's, yeah, I think the thing that Covenants could expand upon in future games that I think is what he's going for, is he does want it to be a little bit deeper, and you can definitely go deeper with the Covenant system. Like personally, I think they kind of inch their way forward with each new release in terms of like how the Covenants interact with things outside the Covenant, or outside of just being a part of the Covenant, right? In terms of the spells, how they interact with other NPCs and stuff like that. But I think one cool factor that would be interesting to see in a future release would be if Covenants have sort of their own, like Covenants already have their own currency, right? But have it where it's a different type of currency than just an item you pick up, and maybe they have special vendors where it's not so, make it less linear, I guess would be the way I would put it, is, like have it be where, maybe instead of giving like one new weapon or spell after 10 items are given, and then another one at like 30 and another one at 50 or whatever, instead you have a shop, and the more powerful the item is, the more expensive things become. That way people can kind of pick and choose what they want. And like that's a really simple way to make it a little bit more varied. But you could also, like we mentioned a second ago, is just like have NPC quest lines that tie into covenants and how those work together and how those interact with other quest lines and stuff like that. Like, you can make them a lot deeper in terms of what you do in the covenant that matters to the covenant within the concept of the game, whether online or offline. But it's one of those things where, at least in my view, it's one of those things where there are so many options available that we kind of just have to wait and see what they choose to do with it, because there's a lot they could do with it. And it's also a thing too where, as much as I enjoy playing these games with other people, especially when people mod it where it's not ridiculously complicated to get people together, um, I do think these games have a focus on sort of the single player experience of the world building and the combat and the overcoming a challenge on your own. And I think that's where the games really hit their stride, is when they're doing the atmospheric world building combat focused stuff that is sort of what the series is known for, right? Like, and I think that's something that the more complicated you make covenants and online stuff because of that, the more complicated it becomes to balance everything, not just in terms of mechanically, but also aesthetically, and conceptually, because you don't want to make a game that's like this and then have half the content of the game be covenant related where it's all online focused, because then you basically turn it into like a World of Warcraft thing almost, where it's like, it's not necessarily about the world building as much as it is like the covenants at that point. But again, they're kind of inching their way forward, trying different little things as each game goes on, and I'm kind of okay with that, because if they make too many changes too radically, or if they make too many radical changes too quickly, that could radically throw off the way the covenants work in that particular game that they use the experiments in. But anyway, rant over. Let's get back into this.
If you imagine that every single faction which Bloodborne features was a joinable covenant with an online element attached to it, pretty quickly players start to ditch the ones with the least action. It would be cool if joining the powder kegs obligated the player to defend old Yarnum from intruders, but if you imagine that there was another task for the Spark Hunters and another for the Choir and Ludwig's successors, you can quickly see that things start to get a bit lonely. Without a vibrant and dedicated enough player base, people would flock to the factions with the action, and the work done on the abandoned ones is sort of wasted.
I mean, again, it's one of those things where there are scripted sequences that mirror online play in games before and after Bloodborne. Dark Souls 3, I think, is a really good example of that, because you have, just well, this one area has two interactions that perfectly sum up the point I'm making. So, Anor Londo in Dark Souls 3, on the one hand, you have the online summoning aspect of it, because Henri's quest line, he or she can summon you to help fight Aldrich, right? And so there's that aspect of online that is preserved offline if you do her quest line correctly. And similarly with Leonhard, is you do the opposite. You go to the bedchamber where Guinevere would have been in the previous game in Dark Souls 1, and you use the orb to invade, and then you kill him and take his shit, and then you go back to your world, right? So online mechanically is preserved within those things where you can see what the online was like without actually having to be online. And they could definitely up the number of instances that include that. This is one reason why I think a lot of games sort of die out after a certain period of time, is because when you make things so dependent on human interaction online, you run the risk of severely crippling your game in the long run. I mean, just look at Call of Duty. Call of Duty is a fantastic example of how this goes poorly. It's like every Call of Duty game, comes out, millions of players pick it up, they play the online, they have a good time, right? Then the next Call of Duty comes out, and the player base of that game every year basically gets halved, or like loses a third of its audience. It's like Call of Duty outdates itself constantly by constantly releasing new games every year, which just splinter the community off into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller sections the farther back you go in the discography. You know, yeah, like you said, Andrew, like Loudtrek and Alicia, it's like they've had examples of online functionality in an offline mode, which I think is a good thing. And kind of the point I'm leading to with Call of Duty is that you could totally make a game like Dark Souls, or like these Dark Souls-esque sort of combat games, and if you included just sort of, do what you kind of already have, like in Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, and Bloodborne, all that stuff, is you have automatic NPC driven invaders and moments where you can invade, right? So just up the number of that. You can keep that going. And I think it's a thing where, that it helps the game in the long run, because you keep the online aspects functional without there actually needing to be players online for it to function, right? And that's one thing that I think makes a lot of games last longer. This is like a good example for me personally is I was a big fan of Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2, like the classic ones from like 2004 and 5. If those games relied on actual players controlling the enemies that you fight, and there was no offline function for fighting against AI, that game would have been dead, far sooner than it was, right? And even then, it's still not dead, right? But like the point I'm making is that those games die when they are built on the backs of actual human players existing, right? I mean, and this is one reason why I think Call of Duty Black Ops had a little bit of a longer lifespan than some other Call of Duties in terms of people playing the multiplayer, was because people wanted to mod combat training, right? They wanted to mod combat training because it was a fun way to play online without having to join a hacked lobby, without having to deal with any of the online bullshit that you typically get in a Call of Duty game. And it functions basically the same as a regular campaign. It keeps people playing the game long after, the game's sort of online community has dwindled, because new games come up and, people's, they get their fill of a game and they move on to the next one. And I think that's something that From Software could definitely capitalize on, is having more sort of online functionality through NPCs that you interact with in certain areas of the game, and certain NPCs you can summon. I think it's a thing where they could definitely make these games last longer in terms of having built-in online functionality with offline sort of bolsters to make it appear online, but it's not really online, And again, all the games have done this fairly well, but they could do better. And that's kind of my point with that.
As it relates to the single player, however, I think there's a lot of room yet to be explored. If we lived in the alternate dimension where Bloodborne's maps still checked the game states and adapted themselves accordingly, you can quickly imagine how these could have ramifications. Maybe powder kegs can access secret tunnels in Old Yarnum to prey on invaders, which in single player translates to less dangerous paths to the boss. Certain NPCs might be more or less prone to aid certain factions. The game has traces of this, as we saw when I dressed up as a member of the church to talk to Adela. Covenants could be a way for the game to liberate the player to perform certain additional tasks in their playthrough, while also punishing them for performing certain other ones. To have a system hovering around the player which subtly guided their playthroughs and allowed each one to feel somewhat distinct, in that while the player would do more or less the same thing, they would do them for different reasons. The changes made to the main story might be as little as enemies having an added chance of dropping blood vials, or the player having access to Covenant exclusive runes, and it might extend to as significant things as Covenant story exclusive areas and bosses. And in the middle of those two, areas might open up and be playable from different directions.
I mean, the thing where he said Covenant specific bosses, I mean, literally Dark Lurker. like they literally do exist, right? Like it's one of those things where it's like I don't know if he is just, I don't know if he forgot about some of these things from the other games, because they are kind of minor. Like they're not a norm, like they're not normal in the games, but they do exist. And I wonder if he either forgot about them or if he's breezing over them because he wants more like them, and they kind of hurt his point if he brings them up as like, yeah, they did it before, but they're just, you know, he wants more of it now, sort of a thing. And I wonder why. I wonder about his reasoning for why he's bringing this up in the way he's bringing it up. You know, because a lot of things he's talking about have existed before or existed post Bloodborne. It's just a matter of, it seems like he wants more of it.
So rather than going from Yharnam to the Witch of Hemwick, a covenant might lead the player to being captured at some point in the story, waking up in Hemwick, and having to make their way back to Yharnam. Reversing maps isn't even that radical an idea. As I noted before fighting Gascoigne, at one point in development, Hemwick was the beginning area of the game. The character creation took place right here, in the Staples. And the player would make their way to the dead hunter, which now drops the rune workshop tool to get to the hunter's dream. Additionally, Dark Souls' Undead Asylum was reused and reversed in that game, with the revisit giving players access to the Stray Demon, the Peculiar Doll, and Hollow Oscar. And in this game, the Nightmare Frontier has been completely reversed. From data mining, it seems like the player was originally supposed to enter it where we now fight the amygdala and make their way to the cave, which is now the entrance. Except it wouldn't have ended in a cave, rather the cave would have linked to the cave where we now enter the nightmare of Mensis. I've made the analogy that a game's core gameplay loop can be thought of as an invisible game director which orbits the player, and that level-specific challenges limit and expand that director's ability to guide the player's expression. And if we expand on that analogy, then the covenants have the potential to impose a micro-director on that director, completely decoupled from the level design or enemy placements. Now, it's one thing for me to say these things, and another entirely to actually map this stuff out so that it works. I'm not saying this is something From Software is at fault for not having done before, and I'm also not really saying that this is what I want. It's entirely possible that these grand announcements of mine would actually make this game play much worse. But, and again, I might be dating this video here, as FromSoft continues to make games, it seems like more of their core is being stripped out to hone in on the combat experience. And I like that experience. But I also like the less hectic, more thoughtful moments in these games. Moments which are created when the game asks me to make a decision other than timing my button presses, and when my interactions with the characters makes me appreciate or despise them. Those
I can kind of agree with that. It is one thing where they are leaning a lot heavy. It does seem that they lean heavier and heavier into the combat as the games go on. And while that can be engaging mechanically, I think they are going to start hitting a ceiling eventually where the combat just becomes so ridiculous that it kind of runs the risk of not having like as much of an impact in terms of people who want to play their games like in the future, right? Like, and everyone has their ceiling of combat that they're willing to deal with before they just kind of tap out and they're like, nah, I'm done. And Elden Ring was the first time where I really hit my ceiling for their style of combat, where it's like, okay, there are some things that I like in Elden Ring, but there are a lot of things I do not in terms of the mechanics of how some of the combat encounters work. But it's one of those things where I did not give up on Elden Ring, but Elden Ring made me reconsider if I want to continue following this company, if they're going to keep pushing the combat the way they're going. And that's kind of the thing that I think kind of all of us in these communities kind of need to think about is like, do we like the direction that each new game is pushing their mechanics into, right? And it's one of those things where it's different for everybody, right? I don't think you're wrong to think that, you know, Elden Ring's their greatest combat system, or think that you know, Dark Souls is their best system, or Demon Souls is their best system. You know, that's totally up to you. Now, in terms of what is, you know, better for certain things about like difficulty, consistency, you know, timing, the way mechanics work, we can debate that forever because that's tangible. We can calculate that, you know. But in terms of where your own personal ceiling is for how far you want to go with this sort of combat, that's really up to the each individual player. And I've kind of reached the point where Elden Ring, Elden Ring's DLC is the first DLC of the series that I'm kind of okay with not getting, because I kind of don't want more Elden Ring combat, especially if it's going to be the traditional From Software DLC where they go above and beyond all the base game stuff, right? Like, I don't want a DLC where every boss is super hard, like super duper Melania, right? I don't want bosses that are way harder than that, because it's like, then I'm just going to tap out and just not play it again. Yeah, I still remember my rant video about Elden Ring. Yeah, and that's the thing is, like, I mentioned it several times throughout different Soulsborne related things, but I think that the thing that they would really benefit from in terms of how they want to change up the combat is by making it a little bit more, making it, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm blanking right now. I apologize. Yeah, okay. So what I would like for them to do is make their combat deeper, not longer. And what I mean by that is make the combat a little bit more intricate as opposed to tedious, right? And one big problem with Elden Ring that I've mentioned several times is that a lot of the bosses near the end game just get really fucking tedious, right? Whether because they have an incredibly huge health pool, or their combos go on forever, or they have some attack where you basically don't do anything for several seconds other than run away. And that's the kind of thing that kind of takes me out of the experience of fighting, those particular bosses. Like, again, I've said it several times. I think Melania could have been the best boss they ever made if they reduced how strong Waterfowl Dance is, and if they got rid of her self-healing. Those two things radically imbalance the fight in her favor, in my opinion. Right? All of her other moves are incredibly well telegraphed, very punishing, but they're not impossible, right? Or they're not borderline impossible, right? And the problem with Melania and other bosses near the end game is that they just do too much fucking damage, right? Within a given combo. Like Melania's Waterfowl Dance is a really good example. It's like, unless you knuckle up with the right item, or you know how to dodge it appropriately, you're probably going to die, right? And that's such an annoying aspect of that fight, is when the enemy pulls out a move that is probably guaranteed to kill you because you're not good against that move yet. And it's one of those things where people would say, "Oh, get good." It's like, well, I don't want to get good anymore because this is the stupid move that I have to deal with, right? And it's similarly, and I would compare it to the Bed of Chaos, is when you have a move that you know you are absolutely going to die against, you don't want to fight the boss anymore, right? You don't want to interact with the boss anymore. You don't want to deal with it anymore, right? And the Bed of Chaos is the example I cite because, when the ground crumbles and their arms are flailing about, you know that if their arm grabs you from a certain section of the board, they're just going to sweep you off and kill you, right? It makes the boss less engaging and more annoying, and that's something that I think Elden Ring's bosses near the late game suffer from a lot. It's just, there's a lot of annoying gimmicks in that game, in that game's finale, that kind of hamper the overall experience in my book, because they have the opportunity to do a lot of interesting shit, but then they just kind of cop out and do a lot of the same shit, but packaged in different ways, but it always comes down to excessive damage, excessive reach, excessive AoE spamming, and those are the things that I think really get me in terms of making me not want to play Elden Ring again, because I don't want to deal with that shit, right? I don't care if it looks pretty. I care if it's deep. And this is one reason why I think Dark Souls 1 combat flows really well, is because Dark Souls 1 was kind of the right amount of getting in between, getting hits in between attacks without having to sit back for several seconds while the boss does their pretty move or whatever, right? And that's one thing that I think made Dark Souls 1 kind of special in a way, is that it was enough technical improvement from Demon Souls to make everything a little bit smoother, but it wasn't so overcomplicated to the point that you had a whole bunch of extra shit to worry about by the time you got to Dark Souls 3 and post Dark Souls 3, right? It was a good balance of the combat was rhythmic and you had a good back and forth between you and the boss most of the time. Now, again, that might just be me talking out of my ass, And maybe Dark Souls is just the difficulty where the ceiling is perfect for me. Maybe that's it, but I just think that these games are going to run the risk of making things too overly complicated. And I think that is going to be an issue moving forward. And we'll see what they do with the DLC to Elden Ring, because I know a lot of people had some complaints about the end game of Elden Ring, so we'll see what the DLC does. We'll see if they learn or if they double down. Because if they double down, I feel like Elden Ring might be sort of their peak in terms of sales, and it might start to trickle after that. But we'll see. I've been wrong before.
Those moments don't come easy, especially in a medium as clumsy with emotion as ours is, and I would really appreciate if this was the area FromSoft decided to dedicate their efforts to. The combat and level design are fun, but I can get that elsewhere. What I don't get elsewhere is a knight whom I freed killing my firekeeper.
Okay, hold on. Let's go back and get that whole point, because that's something I'm going to talk about here in a second.
Decided to dedicate their efforts to. The combat and level design are fun, but I can get that elsewhere. What I don't get elsewhere is a knight whom I freed killing my firekeeper, or an NPC who has always kicked me down some chasm, who I always want to believe won't do it this time. Those are the moments I relish in these games, and I'd like for them to be what sticks around as the studio continues making games more so than anything else.
Okay, so just to be fair to what he just said, he's drawing a comparison between good level design and good combat encounters that he can get elsewhere in different mediums to very, very personalized, like personal favorite, like individualized encounters from NPCs that he likes, right? In other words, he's comparing something that he personally really enjoys to something that a lot of people enjoy about these games, right? Which I think is kind of a bad comparison to kind of make this point. Is like you can find good level design and good combat in a lot of different games, right? The Souls series didn't invent that, right? They just knew how to package it really well, right? But it is just a thing where if you want more encounters like the ones you just mentioned, then you just stay with From Software and keep playing their games, because they continue to do things like that. It's one of those things where it's a weird thing where the way he explained that previous point was just, it comes across as him saying, it's like the game likes doing its combat and levels the way it does, but I like it when it does its gimmicky NPCs more. And it's like, there's nothing wrong with liking that, but making that a point of reference for, kind of what you want to see in the game when you draw a comparison between what these games offer compared to other games, it's a really weird mix. It's a really weird mix of comparisons, because you're comparing level design and combat to a lot of all the other games, and then you cite very, very, very like you broadly bring in all the combat and all the level design of these games, compare that to other games that have very good level design and very good combat, and then you bring in very, very specific encounters from NPCs that you could have just as much fun with any other specific encounter of an NPC in any other game, right? It's not like I wonder why he made that comparison, because it seems like a radically unfair comparison in terms of comparing one aspect that the games do really well compared to other games that do it well versus very specific encounters that he personally enjoys compared to other encounters that anyone else can say they personally enjoy as well, right? It's a really weird way to talk about this section.
Those are the moments I relish in these games, and I'd like for them to be what sticks around as the studio continues making games more so than anything else. I can stomach this Covenant idea of mine not being the best way to produce some of these unique moments, but it's harder for me to stomach that fewer moments like the ones I described is where we're headed. It's hard to gauge what goes on behind the scenes because FromSoft's games always seem to have very hectic productions, but I do fear that the over focus on difficulty has done damage to the studio. If
that's something I can kind of agree now after Elden Ring is the over focus on difficulty has damaged the studio mindset a little bit, and that's something I think we would agree on the point at the base, but then we'd probably spin off in terms of the different ways we think it's affected the series or the series of games that they make.
That the over focus on difficulty has done damage to the studio. If all the feedback which developers get is good level design, good combat, good bosses, then it should come as no surprise that the more subtle implementations which propped those up get culled over time to hone in on what people loved the loudest.
I mean, to a point, he is correct. It's like people will zone in on the things that people like the most, but at the same time, that's where sort of your integrity comes in, right? Like as a creative, right? Like for example, like if you're in a band and you like writing different types of music, but people gravitate towards like the really heavy stuff, and you like making heavy stuff, but you continue to make stuff that's not heavy, that's where that integrity comes in, where you continue to do what you think is best for the overall product instead of giving in to what the community continues to sort of hype up, you know. And I think to a large extent, the series, like each game that they've made, has largely remained consistent in terms of the balance between sort of combat, level exploration, and sort of NPC storytelling type of stuff. I think they've relatively consistently balanced that throughout the games. Again, not finished Sekiro, so I don't know much about that game. But from Elden Ring, Bloodborne, the Dark Souls trilogy, and Demon Souls, like all those things have a pretty balanced sort of comparison between combat focused exploration and NPC interaction and storytelling. Right. What's up, sheep? Glad you made it this time. Yeah, we're going, and I plan to go for another hour. So you didn't show up at the end.
What I'm trying to say is that feedback is a double-edged sword, and we should probably take care to pay tribute to the little things. I like these games because of the unique experiences they provide, and I don't think more combat is the way to get more of them.
I agree.
The Witch of Hemwick boss is probably the weakest one in the entire game, but Hemwick.
What was the rant on Elden Ring? Basically a thing of Acer Aesthetics made a point that the games have kind of leaned into the difficulty because the community rants about the difficulty more than the NPC interactions and storytelling and the uniqueness of some of the encounters in the games. And Elden Ring is kind of a perfect example of that, where they've really pushed the difficulty really far, whereas NPC wise, they've not really done much. They haven't done as much stuff that's new and interesting and invigorating, but they've focused a lot more on the combat and the level design more so than NPC quest lines. And that's kind of the thing that he made, is kind of the point that he made. Also, he made the point that kind of the reception to a game is sort of double edged, where on the one hand you can take from a good reception a lot of good things about your game, or you can take a lot of things that might seem good, but they make you focus on that rather than something else that would help the overall experience. And Acer's example was the combat. The developers constantly get feedback on the combat being, amazing and challenging, and so they really want to focus on that, because people are receptive to that, as opposed to people talking about like NPC quest lines and unique encounters with certain bosses or enemy placements or just what have you. So that's basically the thing you missed. But yeah, that's kind of where we are. We're ranting about Elden Ring while he's talking about Bloodborne.
Itself is an interesting area if you look at it from the perspective of the game's lore. It connects back to that theme of everything which is happening in this world has happened before, and you can actually meet the Witch of Hemwick in the ritual chalice dungeons, where they will spawn mad ones on every level. The idea there is that the witch is an archetype which humans slash Pthumerians revert to, and Hemwick itself is an expression of the same tendencies which produced the chalice dungeons. It's matriarchal. And much like the Chalice dungeons, Hemwick is basically a giant graveyard.
Yeah, and as you said, Sheep, yeah, many people hyper fixating on difficulty rather than world building. And that is one thing too, is I think the thing that makes these games really neat is the mix of fuck Chalice dungeons. Oh yeah, fuck those things. But there's some stupid shit in those dungeons, man. The only good Chalice dungeon is the Comfpk, whatever that one is, that lets you just sit there and farms like blood echoes from that one dead NPC. But yeah, like people hyper fixating on the combat, I think is something that could drive this franchise sort of into the ground in a way, just because it'll become so much more complicated to deal with the combat that the storytelling might end up being pushed further and further and further back in terms of what they actually develop, which is a shame because I think From Software has some really interesting stories to tell, right? And this is one reason why I kind of don't understand where a lot of the hype for Elden Ring came from in terms of I just don't really like one thing with Elden Ring that kind of bugged me was the marketing with like the George R. R. Martin like took part in it. It's like if you played any of the other From Software games, Elden Ring is kind of par for the course. Like in like in terms of what they like to create. Yeah. Yeah, Andrew, I've tried to figure out why the stream keeps trying to book for like future times, and I don't know how to fix it. Yeah. Have I beaten the Chalice dungeons, the half health ones? No, no. No. It's a thing where like I like the idea of the Chalice dungeons, but at the same time, I think they're implemented really kind of poorly. It's also kind of a hassle to get them to set up because you have to find specific items to set them up, then you have to find specific like items to kind of deepen each Chalice dungeon and stuff like that. It seems like an overcomplicated mess that leads to unnecessarily difficult bosses that don't give you a lot of rewards anyway. Like it just seems really fucked, for lack of a better word. They seem like a good idea that got fucked in development for some reason. I mean, I think it's a bunch of good ideas not implemented well. Is probably the way I would put it. Yeah, might be a time zone setting. Yeah, Andrew, I've looked into the time zone things and I've just not figured out how to fix it. I don't know if it's a YouTube thing with my YouTube account or if it's like a StreamYards thing, but I'm trying to fix it. I really am trying to fix it. Um, but for now, just assume that it's going to be something. Just assume the stream is going to be at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, whatever that converts to, wherever you happen to be. That's usually when it's going to be. I will try to fix it on my end as best I can, but again, I'm just really inept and I'm having trouble figuring it out, which is ironic. I can figure out how to stream this, but I can't figure out what fucking time it is. I apologize. Yeah. Yeah. Now I'm just caught up in chat. I just want to talk to you guys. I just want to chat. All right. The fact that there was an amygdala I had to fight at half health, that shit was awful. Awful. I can't wait for this guy to talk about ROM, One Reborn, and Mikolash, my favorite sections to hear people talk about. Those sections are interesting. Yeah. As long as viewers click notify me, the notification comes through anyway. Oh, good. Good. We've found a way around it. We can make this work, at least for now. I actually will try to fix it. I'm trying to fix it. I just don't know the best way to do it. But I will work on this. I will work on this. But yeah, one thing, Sheep. I am looking forward to him talking about ROM, One Reborn, and Mikolash, like the sort of like halfway point to the end game. I'm really interested in talking about that because that's usually where the mechanics start to kind of tick up in terms of like really interesting shit worth talking about. But anyway, he's wrapping up Hemwick. Where are we heading to next? The Nightmare Frontier. Okay, yeah. We got a little while till we get to Rom, I think. Because Rom's in Bergenworth. Yeah. Yeah, we got like another hour. I'm gonna be streaming this for probably the next fucking year. Just it's taking so long to get through.
I will not be doing any online in this video, but I still want to talk a bit about PvP, and I thought I'd use the Hunters, which gatekeep the access to the Nightmare Frontier, to go over some stuff. These sorts of enemies were an interesting change from Dark Souls, where hostile NPCs would invade you to attack rather than be stationary, awaiting your arrival. The hostile NPCs here don't have to navigate the online system to get to you. But since builds are more standardized compared to Dark Souls, the combat between two hunters is less about building a certain strategy and more about on the fly improvisation.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, Sheep. I like the areas with the bosses, but like a lot of the I don't like the one. I definitely hate Rom. I'm gonna put that out right now. If there's one thing I'm racist against, it's Rom. Okay, fuck Rom. It's a stupid boss. But One Reborn, I've got mixed feelings about, and I actually kind of like the Mikolash fight. I think he does way too much arcane damage in that one sort of like arcane thing he does, but other than that, I kind of like the way that fight works. I think it's neat. The NPCs are broken, by the way. I feel like infinite FP is fine in Dark Souls, but infinite bullets, come on. Yeah, there's just a lot of shit. There's a lot of shit. I mean, this is one thing too, where I think this is one reason why I wish From Software did like mini franchises. Like I think they could actually take a lot of these interesting ideas in these kind of one-offs and really refine them. Kind of like how Dark Souls 1 had a bunch of ideas that Dark Souls 2 experimented with, and then Dark Souls 3 refined it from 1 and 2 while still learning from things like Bloodborne. Like I think it would make each game in those sort of trilogies a lot deeper in terms of really mastering the mechanics of those specific like franchises. Plus, people would love it. Like people would love a Bloodborne 2 and 3. Yeah. All right. Oh yeah. Yeah, Andrew, you can live vicariously through us as much as you want. All I'm saying is, might be better off to watch people play Bloodborne than go through the hassle of buying a system and then playing it yourself. Oh. Rom's one of those bosses where I feel like unless you have like certain broken modes, you're just gonna have a bad time. Just Rom. I can't wait to hear what he says about Rom. I'm really curious what he's gonna say about Rom. Now that you got me thinking about it, I wonder if he's going to be a contrarian and say it's a fantastic boss for different reasons, or if he's going to agree with the community that it kind of sucks. But either way, we'll see.
Now, a skilled hunter will understand that there's really no shame in using the best gear in the game. Just because Ludwig's Holy Blade is kind of a black hole to the game's build varieties, and because it's a bit overplayed, it doesn't diminish its legitimacy, because really, it's just about getting the job done. That's all that matters.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Sheep. It's like, even though I had a lot of problems with Dark Souls 2, it did do a lot of experimentation, which is necessary for growth, right? Now, granted, I think it tried to grow in a lot of bad directions, but still that growth is important. It's good to experiment, and this is why I think a trilogy would work, is because your first game is a complete foray into a new idea. The second game, you can experiment and tweak things based on sort of feedback you got to the first game. Then the third game is where you refine all the experiments that you've tried up to that point. I think it could work, but again, From Software is really weird. It also seems like Sony just gives them a hard time, because every game that they've made like for Sony has not had any sort of like sequel made. It's weird. It's weird. I wonder if that's like a Sony thing, or if it's just they hate Sony because of the bullshit they went through with Demon Souls the first time around. I don't know. That's insane. Killing the little spiders would kill me because I'd die, then start from the top. Yeah. That's the thing. One thing I've found with a lot of bad bosses throughout these games is like if you take out one specific aspect of the fight, you can actually make it a lot more bearable. You know, like the Bed of Chaos, for example. If you take out the floor crumbling, I actually think the boss could be engaging, right? It's just really fucking annoying because it's got huge hitboxes that drag you all over the place, and then it drops you into a death pit. It's like it's stupid. You know, at the very least, it could be difficult without being like annoying. You know, and Rom's kind of a similar way. If Rom didn't have the little spiders around her and just kind of cast spells at you or whatever, I think it would actually be less bullshit and more engaging. But that's me. I think some things can be saved if there are just little tweaks made. Yeah, bonfire aesthetics were cool, but they were broken. I would change the way bonfire aesthetics worked if they ever did them. If they had done them in 3, just because I think that was. Oh yeah, I think it's just one of the things where like there are a lot of good ideas in Dark Souls 2 that were poorly implemented, and I think it might be better if some of them were just dropped moving forward. Because bonfire aesthetics as an idea, I think are really cool, but the way you balance them, I think, is probably have to get rid of the soul values from the boss that you repeat, because then you run into problems with people boosting bosses that are easy that give a lot of souls. You know, like I've done a lot throughout a lot of my videos, are boosting the Rotten, right? Like he's super easy to get to early game, and you can boost him just over and over and over for hundreds of thousands of souls easily, and it breaks the game. Now, granted, I think Dark Souls 2 is just kind of broken to begin with, but it's broken in sort of a fun way once you know how to fuck with it. But yeah, yeah, and the floor caving in, you know, there's zero good indications for that. You know, it's again, it's one of those things where like they could make it good. They could make it good. You know, just a couple little tweaks. Yeah, it's just anyway. We're gonna spiral into talking about other games. I need to finish this video. I need to finish this video so I can talk about something else.
A skilled hunter will also understand that there's really no shame in utilizing the enemy's dumb AI to get a free backstab in. This isn't cheap so much as it exemplifies my superior tactics to the AIs. And frankly, accusations of cowardice are nothing more than cope from those who don't have the raw skill set to get the job done. On a serious note, though, first encounters in Bloodborne can be difficult to gauge because simple observation does not feed the player enough info for them to know what they're in for. Magics are not attached to equipped weapons, so an insta-kill arcane blast of some sort is always a looming danger, but there's also to consider how each weapon setup changes what an optimal strategy is. The transformed version of my weapon is relatively slow, so I'm open to parries when I use it. That being said, a single hit is often enough to finish the fight because of the recovery frame locks, so timing my heavy attacks to coincide with the enemy's swing is a good gamble that I'm going to walk away victorious. In talking about PvP, I just casually threw the phrase build variety your way. And my saying that Ludwig's Holy Blade is a black hole for build varieties is in reference to how one's access to Ludwig's Holy Blade can easily turn the game into one where you two-hand version of this weapon your way through the entire game. Bloodborne has been accused by some of having limited build variety compared to its predecessors.
Yes, I am one of those people. I am one of those people that says there's very limited build variety in Bloodborne. And when I say build variety, I mean actual build variety. I don't mean differences in a weapon that either slashes or hacks. I mean an actual build difference, not just melee slap them up. You know. Yeah, also considered counter damage. Yeah, yeah. That's one thing. One thing that I think is kind of a pro and a con of these games is that you kind of have to learn on your feet. And sometimes the games are good at displaying that. Sometimes they're not. I think Dark Souls 2 is probably the most egregious in terms of not telling you things that would be absolutely useful to know. I think the ADP is probably the best example of it. Because if you don't know what ADP does, outside of the description, you're going to have no idea that it affects your iframes at all, right? You're not going to have any fucking clue, So you're going to roll around thinking your rolls are normal, and they're not. And it's because the iframe system is tied to a stat that you have to level up to get sort of a basic iframe amount going. Otherwise you got to like super time everything, or things are going to tag you, way before or after they should have. It's just weird. Yeah, ADPB like boosts evasion and other actions. Yeah, it's like thanks for the descriptor of that. But that is one thing where Dark Souls 2 is the most egregious, but all the games kind of suffer from just unknown mechanics that you kind of have to figure out while dealing with the thing that's causing you issues. It's weird, but it's one of those things where it's kind of a pro-con thing depending on how you look at it. And I think it's a thing where, on the one hand, learning on your feet is interesting, but on the other hand, it can be very frustrating when you don't understand why something's going the way it does.
And that's a point which has some legitimacy, but it's not like more build variety is better in the abstract. A tighter range of expression can be more immersive to interact with, if only because the removal of, say, item weight means that there's no incentive for players to walk around naked anymore. Bloodborne's online is not as silly as Dark Souls is, and if that's important to you, then you might have to thank the limitations placed on build varieties for that.
I mean, every game can have ridiculous online stuff. Bloodborne's no exception to the rule. I mean, have you seen the fucking top hat that people can wear? I mean, of course I want to run around in my underwear with a top hat killing dudes. It's a national pastime in Yarnum. Yeah, or look things up. Yeah, that's one thing. Is like I think Bloodborne's online isn't as silly as Dark Souls 1. You're right, because it's dead. Yeah. Well, again, it's one of those things where I think this is one reason why From Software just doesn't partner with Sony anymore. Is just they don't give them enough breathing room, and that kind of kills the game over time. Because think about it this way: like you take the audience of Demon Souls, which grew after Dark Souls 1, which probably continued at that same pace after Dark Souls 2, and then you go back to just being a Sony product, and it's like, dude, you're missing out on everyone that you brought over with Dark Souls. It's like, come on. Like I would pay full damn price for a PC Demon Souls and Bloodborne. I would do it. Even with all the problems I've dealt with in those games on console, I would still pay top dollar for those games. One, because I think they're good games overall, but also because I would love to play that shit on the like system that I am used to, right? All this specific shit is just annoying at this point, and I'm very much against console exclusivity at this point. But anyway, let's get back to this actual video. I keep ranting about just random shit. It is fun talking with chat, though. It's very fun. I want to get back to the point he was making about the build variety, though, because I've got something to say about that.
Compared to its predecessors, and that's a point which has some legitimacy, but it's not like more build variety is better in the abstract.
It's not like build variety is better in the abstract. Okay.
The range of expression can be more immersive to interact with, if only because the removal of, say, item weight means that there's no incentive for players to walk around naked anymore. Bloodborne's online is not as silly as Dark Souls is, and if that's important to you, then you might have to thank the limitations placed on build varieties for that. Of course, that it suffers from limited build varieties is an argument which has sort of lost steam over the years.
Hold on a minute. He's making so many like points that I'm like double taking at. It's just I need to back this up and take it part by part. It's so annoying that they don't add those games to PC. I don't even have a PC, but these games should be accessible for everyone. Yeah, it's just one of those stupid things that it's one of those stupid things that these companies do to get people to buy their system, and then after people buy the system, it's like they don't release a bunch of good games for the console anyway. So it's like fuck. It's like, come on. I mean, imagine how much more copies of the Demon Souls remake would have been had, right? Like if they released it on like more than just the PS5. Like imagine how much higher the sales would have been if they released on Xbox, PlayStation, and like PC. I think after the hype of Elden Ring and kind of seeing where it quote unquote all began, I think you could actually have a serious like pull for that. Yeah, like you're saying, Sheep, it ties more into the aesthetic. It makes sense because in this world you're using these tools. Oh, whoops! I mixed one comment with the other. Shit. Yeah, you're not going to be a full tank and iron armor in this game or a spellcaster. It sucks that the build variety is kind of not there, but it makes sense because in this world you're using these tools with hunting in mind. Yeah, it's one of those things where I think the aesthetic of the world and the story they're telling, there's not room for that many builds in terms of what they're kind of doing. I think that is something that can be limiting mechanically, but I think aesthetically it does sort of fit. Like something like it's kind of like watching movies. Some movies have a blend of different things just because they have a lot of shit in them to begin with, right? Like the Lord of the Rings trilogy by Peter Jackson's a really good example. It's like you got a good bit of kind of everything in there. You got a little bit of comedy in there, with like Pippin and Gimli, some of their comments and things. You have a lot of sort of horror aspects with some of the creepier things, like with Gollum and Sheila the spider. You get a lot of great action, with all the like war scenes and shit. You get some decent romance in there between different people. It's like some things are a complete package just because they're a complete package anyway, right? But other things don't need to be that. Like take any sort of action movie, right? Like John Wick or something. Like John Wick does not need romance, right? It's just a dude killing dudes that killed his dog. It's like you don't need anything deeper than that. You don't need comedy in it. You don't need any of that shit. You just need action, right? Some things don't need to have everything, and some things can balance everything. And it really just depends on how you pull off what you're trying to pull off. Yeah, Microsoft battling that by buying Bethesda and Activision so games won't go on PS5 unless they want them to. Yeah, that's just kind of scummy. Yeah. Well, this is one thing that I think will happen eventually is I think that a lot of these companies that are a lot of these mega companies that are buying the game like studios, I think they're going to hit a financial breaking point because you cannot be making as much back on system sales in terms of like the purchase, like the ratio that you've got to be making from buying a studio to put their games on one console as opposed to like 3 different types. That's got to eat into your profits. Like that has to eat into your profits when you're excluding it from basically your other competitor and also like like PC. It's so like it's got to eat into your profits at some point. It's got to eat into it at some point. And I think there also is like legal ramifications if you get sort of too big. When you become sort of the monopoly in terms of like every game that's sold in like North America, for example. I wonder if like I don't know how laws for monopolization work in different parts of the world, but there is kind of a point. There's going to be a breaking point somewhere. I think most of it will probably be community based. Where players will just be like, you know what, I don't want to buy this game. I don't want to buy your system to buy your game, so I'm not going to do it. And because of that, people are going to give up on a franchise that they probably liked, but they just don't want to deal with the specificity of it. Like imagine if you buy a new system, right, for Call of Duty or something, and then they make it where it's only Xbox, right? It's like, well, I mean, I guess I'm not buying another Call of Duty game. Like that's one thing that I think is I just don't think it's good for business. Now, if you bundled things, I think that would be different, right? Like if you bought a game, like if you bought like some games that were cross-platform, you know, but if you bundled it with a system, like from like the company that like owns the studio that makes the games, I think that's something that could work. You know, like bundle Call of Duties with like an Xbox or something instead of just having everything be massively overpriced. Yeah, like this game wants to be more gritty, more eldritch horror-esque. Yeah, and that's what the thing is. Like this game could not work with like miracles in it. I don't think it would work with miracles or, you know, like sorcery as well as the other games do. Just because this game's more, like you said, it's more sort of gritty and, you know, eldritchy horror. It's not like hard magic like Harry Potter shit. You know. But anyway, let's go back to these points he's making because I was going to talk about them, then we started talking about game companies eating other game companies. Oh man, so many rants today.
In the abstract. A tighter range of expression can be more immersive to interact with, if only because the removal of, say, item weight means that there's no incentive for players to walk around naked anymore.
All right, so talk about the players rolling around naked. Players will only roll around naked when they are min-maxing their build to make the most out of the weapons they're holding. Or, well, gear they're holding, because you can do that with shields too. You know, but this is the thing too, is you can make builds that are aesthetically pleasing where you don't look like a total dipshit, but you're going to have to be careful with your item weight as a result of that, right? Like you can't just go full naked, you know, and then expect to look cool when you're running around with a big sword, but in your undies, right? It's like, yeah, it's a little ridiculous, but you can do that in Bloodborne too. Like, just because it exists as a common thing in one game doesn't mean that you can't do it in the other one, right? You know, now there's more incentive to do it in Dark Souls or in the other games as opposed to Bloodborne, you know, as you don't really get a benefit from losing armor in Bloodborne, but you know, it's a difference in how the mechanics work. And it's like you can still have ridiculous looking builds in Bloodborne too, like we talked about. You know, fucking naked top hat clan, go attack people right now.
Bloodborne's online is not as silly as Dark Souls is, and if that's important to you, then you might have to thank the limitations placed on build varieties for that. Of course, that it suffers from limited build varieties is an argument which has sort of lost steam over.
Limited build varieties has lost steam. That argument, yeah. Let's see how he defines this. This is where we're probably going to get into some real meat.
Suffers from limited build varieties is an argument which has sort of lost steam over the years. In Bloodborne's early days, I remember there being some genuine animus towards this, but as the game's intricacies have been figured out, and as players have pushed high-level play to further heights, I think it's apparent that many of the initial complaints were unfounded.
All right, many initial complaints are unfounded. Okay, one thing I want to go back to one thing he said here.
Animus towards this, but as the game's intricacies have been figured,
The game's intricacies. It's not the intricacies that make the builds more various in the game. It's the eccentricities, right? When you can do something like Impha did, where you essentially have an unlimited ammo Gatling cannon shooting enemies all over the place, right? You can do that in the game, but that doesn't make it a common build, right? Just because you can utterly break the game doesn't mean that that's build variety, right? That, you know, my definition of build variety comes from basic builds that are fundamentally different in the way they work, right? In terms of like what they do and how they kind of do it, sort of a thing. You know, and like the Soul series are really good examples of that because it's really easy to define each build based on a couple of words, right? You know, glass cannon, very obvious what that means. Very little armor, very heavy weapon, very easy to understand. All right, tank, heavy armor, big shield, very easy to understand. Miracles, okay, you have some sort of talisman that does miracle shit, okay? So probably a lot of healing, maybe some lightning throwing, right? Sorcerer, you get magic. You are throwing magic at people, a lot of ranged spells, you know, maybe a lot of magic shielding, stuff like that. Bleed, right? You have weapons that deal bleed damage. It's very simple to the point, but you can see all the different varieties of those builds as sort of basic pathways that you can go down in terms of how you choose to play the game, right? In Bloodborne, it's not the same because all of these weapons have a similar functionality in terms of how they fight enemies. Sure, their movesets are different, their special moves are different, and their damage types are different, but they're not significant enough to warrant a they're not significant enough to warrant a difference of explanation in terms of how a build would work with said weapon, right? Like working with, for instance, let's just use Dark Souls 1 for example. Working with the Black Knight sword, right? Or let's go even higher. The Black Knight Ultra Great Sword, right? That is a heavy, hard-hitting weapon, right? Which means you're going to be able to wield that. And if you want to be able to roll, you're probably going to want to go light, lightweight in terms of your armor and stuff like that. It's just there's a lot to go over with that to make that build work. And it's a thing where the way that build works is different, not just because of a weapon difference, but because of how all the mechanics coalesce around using that weapon, right? Like, what are the mechanical differences of switching weapons in Bloodborne apart from what the weapon actually does? Nothing really. I mean, that's nothing really changes, right? Like your reach might increase or decrease, and the damage type will change, but that's not that different from having, different builds that have very different ways of combat functioning. And that's an overarching kind of point against Bloodborne, is that the builds are very restrictive because of that, right? Like, there are several different ways to damage enemies in the Souls series that are effective given the build that you're in. Whether it be bleed, taking out a percentage of a boss's health or a tough enemy's health, or just having a big ass weapon that just smacks the crap out of everything, or whether you're using magic to shoot from range or miracles to outlast an enemy, or if you're just tanking and mitigating as much damage as possible. Like, all those things function differently in terms of how they affect combat. Whereas with Bloodborne, you're most likely dodging absolutely everything. You're most likely hacking and slashing at absolutely everything most of the time, right? The only real changes are when you have specific items that do specific things that are very different from your basic sort of melee combat. And I'm laying all that out now because I have a feeling he's going to try to make it seem like that's not the case.
Out, and as players have pushed high-level play to further heights, I think it's apparent that many of the initial complaints were unfounded. As it turns out, Bloodborne does not have limited build variety, it just has fewer avenues of player expression compared to its predecessors.
So, limited build variety. It's one of those things that I hate when people say, it's not actually this, but it's this.
Out, and as players have pushed high-level play to further heights, I think it's apparent that many of the initial complaints were unfounded. As it turns out, Bloodborne does not have limited build variety, it just has fewer avenues of player expression compared to its predecessors.
Okay, so the point he just made is literally saying it's not that it's got limited builds, it's that it just doesn't have as many builds as the previous ones, which is like, okay, that's the problem. That's what we're talking about. Yeah, it's like other playstyles probably wouldn't work. You need to be aggressive, and having these gigantic weapons wouldn't work. Yeah, and that's the thing about the Soul series that makes combat engaging on different levels, is because you have all the different strategies that come up from different types of combat in terms of what certain things do, right? Like, all of the Bloodborne weapons, for the most part, just deal a certain physical type of damage. They might have an arcane scaling, and then they slap, right? They slap enemies for varying amounts, right? And while that works and while that's good, it's not as deep as the other games that came previously because, like you mentioned, Sheep, is like the other magic types, like miracles, like miracles would not be better than blood vials, as they'd surely cost bullets. Bosses would eat you alive as a sorcerer. Yeah, it's like Bloodborne is a fundamentally different game, so it's okay to have these differences, but the limitation the criticism of the limitations that will come from the aesthetic change are things that are absolutely warranted. Like, you could totally figure out a way to make more builds in Bloodborne style, given the technology of the time and given what you wanted to do, right? Like, instead of having I think every build should have sort of a basic melee weapon, and then after that, it kind of boils down to how you use your other tools, right? Like, maybe instead of having a gun, you have some sort of arcane item, right? So maybe it shoots some sort of arcane barrage, or it functions like a gun, but instead of it being, something that's mainly used for parrying and does very little damage, maybe it's buffed where it does a decent bit of damage, but it costs more bullets in the game, right? Like, maybe you enchant your bullets or some shit with arcane, and it does a lot more damage, but it costs you a lot more bullets, right? And they could balance that by increasing the number of bullets you have. It's just one of those things that there are ways to deepen this system without having to just basically say that, oh, it's not that limited. It's just limited by comparison, which was the problem in the first fucking place. But what have you?
A single trick weapon can shake up a build more than many cumulative features in Dark Souls would, but
That's a fucking lie. Where's my sound effect? I need my fucking sound effects. Where's my sound effects?
What? What? What?
Bruh.
What?
Bruh.
There we go. Yeah, like you mentioned, Sheep, they have the runes that increase your bullet amounts. It could definitely work. And plus, that's not even accounting for if they actually balanced it properly too. Yeah, but that thing you just said, let's back it up again.
of player expression compared to its predecessors. A single trick weapon can shake up a build more than many cumulative features in Dark Souls would.
That's not true. That's not true. What do you mean by cumulative too? What's your point with that? It's like a trick weapon has two different states, right? You got the one-handed and the two-handed variant. They can function differently, but a lot of weapons in the other games can also do something similar when you one or two hand them, right? Or if you choose to light attack or heavy attack them. This is not that is not a good that's not a good defense of trick weapons. The thing about trick weapons that makes them interesting is how they function when they're in their transformed state. That's what makes them more interesting, is because you essentially get two weapon move sets from the same weapon, right? Now, those weapons on their own are deeper than the basic Dark Souls weapons, right? That much is true, but your build is not radically changed whether you hit with a couple of quick slashes or you spin around in a circle, right? At the end of the day, it's still melee combat. It's still basic melee combat where your damage type doesn't really change that much, and your end result is that you have to get in melee range and smack them with a weapon. Every build in Bloodborne does that, apart from the crazy ones, right? And the crazy ones are crazy because they're ridiculous to get. It's like, really? Yeah, like he says, most of the trick weapons, you're not even using the tricked versions, usually one or the other. It's like, yeah, it's one of those things where Bloodborne created trick weapons, which are neat. And this is one thing too, is using the saw cleaver during one of my playthroughs, I hardly ever use the trick version of it. It's just more cumbersome. It's slower and it reaches a little farther. That's not really worth the trade-off in terms of speed and damage to me. Right. It's it's one thing too, is when you have a weapon that's built for parrying, the guns in the game, and you purposely give people weapons where they won't use the guns, it's that's you're kind of fighting your own system, right? Just because you don't use the weapon to parry doesn't mean that your build is radically changed because of that. It's you still use the weapon, you just don't parry now, which is probably going to be bad for you because, bullets don't really have any purpose if you don't use the gun, right? The game is built for you to use your guns. That's why they spawn bullets on enemies. That's why you have a bullet counter. That's why you have all this shit, right? It's just oh my god, there's so much stupid. You're almost always better off using the untricked version, with exceptions like Whirligig Saw or Hunter Axe. Yeah, that's the thing. The first time I played Bloodborne, I actually used the Hunter Axe, and it actually is pretty useful in its tricked form. you know, and the whirligig saw is just funny, just having like a chainsaw going through the world. But you know, it is one of the things where just like he's just pulling shit out of his ass to try to defend this criticism of the game. It's like Bloodborne is interesting on its own. You don't have to make shit up or recontextualize things to try to prove a point that this thing is like fine. It's like game's got problems. Let it have problems. It's fine. Like acknowledge the problems, then they can improve in the next one. Anyway, let's get that again because I think he's going to make another point afterward.
Weapon can shake up a build more than many cumulative features in Dark Souls would, but it's still just a single choice compared to however many smaller choices were present in that game.
Okay, so he does qualify it a little bit. Let's go back and get the full context of that again.
Cumulative features in Dark Souls would, but it's still just a single choice compared to however many smaller choices were present in that game. So
yeah, it's just I think one thing too about Bloodborne is that it's kind of streamlined the whole build thing to a certain extent, and that's the kind of word I would use. Is that by making the game so focused on trick weapons and parrying with the guns, you've essentially sort of honed in on how you want people to play the game to a certain extent. And I think that's one reason why Bloodborne can be sort of fun as an introduction to kind of this kind of series, and it expands further on. But that it is a problem where, because of that, unless you're going to do some weird build that requires specific items, your build can't really function unless it revolves around trick weapon 2-handing, maybe trick weapon 1-handing or whatever. But, you know, trick weapon focusing or parry focusing, right? There's, you know, or just regular hack and slash. It's like those aren't really that different in terms of builds, right? It's like you're using your melee weapon as your primary source of damage. You might parry. Okay, there's a difference. Whoop-de-doo. Yeah, and just it's one of those things that cumulative line about Dark Souls 1 says a lot to me. That like I've been told by other streams that he has played the other games. After that, I don't know if I believe him, right? Because like Dark Souls 1 has a lot of mix and matching things that you can do. Now, granted, you have to sink levels into things to make them work properly, but it's like, come on, man, you need to, like, there are some things that are fundamentally true about certain games, right? It's like you don't have to fight this hard to make it work where Bloodborne is just misunderstood. It's like, no, it's like the builds are more restrictive because the world is more restrictive in how it wants you to tackle things, right? That's not necessarily a negative in terms of how the game functions. You know, it's not like, you know, it's not like they give you an area in this game that would be perfect for sorcery and you don't have sorcery, right? It's not like they do that to you. You know, it's not like the game is built to work with the build that they want you to sort of play the game with, right? It's not as varied as Dark Souls, but it's more focused towards sort of the parrying hunter trick weapon types, right? Which works for the game because it's built to work with the game. You know, there's not all these excess variables coming from all the different builds in terms of like bleed damage and sorcery and extra healing from miracles and, you know, like strength builds with super stunning weaponry and all this other stuff. It's like those can't exist, but focusing on the way Bloodborne chose to do combat means that the world can focus more on how to deal with that type of combat, which can make the encounters a little bit funner depending on how they implement it. And I think they did well in some places, but bad in others. Can you imagine Bloodborne with all these build types? Everyone would just complain about them not being good for this type of combat. It's like, yeah, it's one thing. It's like Bloodborne's a fundamentally different game, which is part of the reason why I think you can give it a pass when talking about certain things that the other series did beforehand. But given that, there are a lot of lessons that were learned during the production of previous games. You know, and this is one thing that is very obvious when you look at the healing and the resource management of this game, right? Demon Souls did not have a cap on its healing, how much healing you could carry at a time. And, well, I mean, that's somewhat untrue. There was a cap, but it was ridiculously high, right? You could hold 99 grass. That's a lot of fucking healing items. That's a lot. That's one type of grass. That's not counting every single type of grass, right? Dark Souls made a significant change with the Estus, right? And when they were making this game, they clearly thought, okay, we do need to limit the healing, but we also want them to be able to replenish it in the world. So how do we make that work? Well, blood vial system they have here. You can pick them up off of enemies. You get 20 at the base, but you'll go through plenty of them, and we're going to sort of match the difficulty where you can heal a lot more, but we expect you to take a lot more damage too. So they've balanced it accordingly. And also imagine all the functionality that would have to have been changed if they had all the different builds from the previous games just shoved in here for no real reason, right? Like a good example is this game doesn't need miracles, right, in it. Like, it doesn't need them mechanically, and it doesn't need them like aesthetically. So you don't need to include it, right? Like this is an eldritch horror, gritty sort of bloody smack 'em up type of game, and that's not meant to be derogative. That's what it is. It's a game about cutting the shit out of beasts, with whatever tools you can find, right? This isn't a high fantasy concept, with like heavy emphasis on magic. This is like cosmic horror, with random biological mutagens, right? It's grittier and more bloody, right? And so they made things that help facilitate the bloody and cosmic aspects of that design. And that's one reason why I think the builds in this game are fine. We don't need build variety, but it would have been nice if there were other options. And I'm still responding to chat, so I'm probably a comment or two behind. Yeah, and going back to the start, Matthew Matosis maybe shouldn't have gave the go ahead. Well, this is one reason why I don't think you should ask permission to give an opinion or to explain something that you think is true, right? Like I'm doing it right now. I didn't get Acer's permission. Fuck getting permission. Fuck that shit. Right? Give your opinions. Give them freely. But given that, be willing to take criticism too. That's how it works. And it's like, here we are, having a grand old time. Yeah. As much as I love being OP, the Estus system is what I enjoy. DS2, I am constantly above 60 life gems, rarely below 50. Yeah, it's like, and I think that's the thing that Dark Souls 2 ultimately proved with the healing that they had tried, is that when you give people too many healing options on top of ones that refresh, it just makes the game really sort of, there's no attritious value to the game, which I don't even know if attritious is a word. But, there's no attrition to a game when you get healing constantly, right? It only really comes in a boss fight, right? And even then, like, some things are balanced. Like, I think Bloodborne is fairly balanced in terms of its healing to difficulty, right? But Dark Souls 2 is not. You can see that whenever you defeat, what is it? You defeat one boss, and then you have the ability to buy life gems that are relatively cheap, and you can hold 99 of them. Each of them, I think, gives 500 HP, and with 99 of them, that'd be 49,500 HP on you at any given time. That's a lot of fucking health from the beginning of the game. Like, it's not even balanced towards the end of the game. You get that early. I always love thinking that they added life gems because they realized, oh shit, we can't beat this with just Estus. Yeah, that is one thing. I do like the Estus shard idea, but just like, I really like, one thing that I do when I look at games is I always look at the finished work in comparison to the other finished works, because I think I talked about this in another stream, but you need to look at what they ultimately released, because that is what they ultimately approved of. It's not what was developed, what was in development. It was what was developed and what was released. While it is valuable to talk about the ideas they had, what they released is ultimately more important in my book. And that's why I think Dark Souls 2 is such a stain on the community, or on the franchises that they've made, because it's such a aforementioned like drunken fuck up in terms of balancing, and it's ridiculous because of that. Not to mention that everything's kind of simple by comparison to a lot of other stuff. In terms of like how the difficulty works. Yeah, like that. Like if all the life gems were rare, like the higher tier ones, then you could make an argument that the game is more balanced, at least in terms of healing. But they just, whew. I think one thing too about Dark Souls 2 is I made this point in another one of my videos. I forget which one, but I made a point that Dark Souls 2 isn't. They've never really made a proper Dark Souls sequel, in my opinion, because they take a lot of things from other games that they made previously, right? Like, there are a lot of elements in Dark Souls 2 where you can view it as sort of a spiritual sequel to Demon Souls, more so than a sequel to Dark Souls 1. A lot of that has to do with the way the level design works and stuff like that. You know, it's very pathway based. It's not like Dark Souls where there are several different pathways that take you to different areas that loop around on each other and come into contact with a lot of different areas. You know, Dark Souls 2 is much more like Demon Souls, where it's like, okay, if you want to get to the Rotten, you go down the pit, and then you go through the rat area, then you go through the gutter, then you go through the poison statue area, then you're at the Rotten. Pathway's done. No need to return there unless you're doing dark, quest lines or like a dark lurker shit. It's very just sequential of like bam, 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 bam. Okay, you're done. Move on to the next one. And Dark Souls 1 didn't really have that because, the area where the bell gargoyles are, it's near Andre. It's also near Firelink Shrine. It also helps you with NPC stuff, right? So it's, it's deeper and works better in a world function rather than just being a level you have to beat to progress the game. And that's one problem that I think Bloodborne does suffer from as well, is that it's a little, it's very linear after a point. And that can become a little underwhelming when you look at sort of Dark Souls. Dark Souls, you go from, you go through a couple of different areas to get to the two bells, right? And you can tackle either one of them depending on the items you spawn with, right? If you get the key, or if you know how to get around to it, to Blighttown early on, right? Then you go to Anor Londo, and then the game opens up again, where you got to go to the four corners, defeat the four lords, and then you come back to the center to fight Gwyn again, right? It's like it sends you out, railroads you, but then sends you out again, and then like it's constantly giving you options to like go back and forth between new shit and old shit, new shit and old shit. Whereas Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 to an extent, like they're very linear after a point, and that can be not pushed. That can be viewed negatively in terms of like you kind of just go through an area, and then when you're done, you don't really have a reason to go back. Dark Souls 2 also suffers from this as well, but it's like it's more linear in terms of actual progression in Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. Still waiting on the Dark Souls game with the hub as beautiful as Majula and good world connectivity like Dark Souls 1's first half. This is one thing is, for all the shit that I give Elden Ring, I would have told you that Dark Souls 1's map was the greatest until Elden Ring. Elden Ring's map is phenomenal. And I do think that they truly did create some really amazing shit in terms of the level design in Elden Ring, especially with the verticality of jumping and stuff like that. Like that having some dedicated parkour like mechanics, I think really helped make that world that much more engaging. But Majula is extremely relaxing. It's extremely chill. It is extremely chill. But let's get back into this. I keep ranting about stuff, which is fun. So we've been going for about 2 hours, and we've gotten about, what is that, like 18 minutes, 20 minutes through the video. Fuck, this is going to take forever. Oh, well.
It's less a question of limited variety of builds and more a question of less decision-making to facilitate those builds. And nitpicky as this sounds, there is a difference. Theoretically, if both games have 10 builds, then those builds have hazier parameters in Dark Souls, since each individual stat could be dialed around a bit to make certain fringe deviations possible.
I mean, that's kind of true. 2 hours for 18 minutes. Oh, yeah, making good time. Woo! Yeah, we're getting there.
Like which pyromancy to use, or whether a sorcerer dumps a level into dexterity to have a surprise katana attack up their sleeve or something. It's the little nuanced decisions like that. The reason I'm specifically making a distinction on these grounds rather than just paying the difference is that in its current state, For Bloodborne to have more builds, it'd need more weapons, and the parameters under which the weapons are designed around have very few avenues left to be explored.
I think that's just I think what he just said there is a fundamental misconception. Like, you don't need more weapons to make more builds. You need more ways to use things in combat. That's what differentiates the builds, right? Like, if every build that used some type of magic functioned the same, it would be annoying, but they function differently. Like, for example, like with sorceries are really good at just spamming magic against enemies that are really tough. But the way they counteract those compared to miracles is that miracles offer a lot of healing. They offer a lot of buffs and bonuses and protective things, right? So even though you can chuck lightning spears, just like you could chuck, great soul arrow or whatever, the builds are still differentiated by the fact that one of them is all DPS and one of them is mostly healing. And that's how the builds are differentiated: is you have one that gives extra survivability and one that gives extra damage. And it's similar to managing damage as well. Is the trade-offs in terms of how those things function in compared to one another. Like what he said with the Bloodborne weapons is more weapons does not mean more builds, right? It's the way that combat is implemented with different ways to deal damage, right? It's not just how many weapons you have, because at the end of the day, if you have a one-handed sword and that's the only type of weapon you allow yourself to use, that doesn't mean that because I'm just throwing out a number, I don't know off the top of my head, but let's say Dark Souls 1 has 10 one-handed swords. No special unique quality to them. They're just one-handed swords that you can one-hand pretty easily, and they're basic one-handed swords. Decent speed, okay damage. That doesn't mean there's 10 builds because those weapons exist. That just means that there's 10 different weapons that you can use in a build that would use a small sort of like sword, right? Similarly to the trick weapons, is some of the trick weapons are very similar in the way they're used. Like, they're just a hack and slash sort of weapon, right? Where the differences come in is when you trick them up and how those tricks function, right? Like the Whirly Jigsaw is a good example of how to make a trick weapon with a very unique functionality that the other ones do not have. Same thing with I forget what the sword's called in this game, but it's not the. Is it called the Moonlight Greatsword? They've redone that sword so many damn times in all the games. I forget what they're called. Like in between different ones, but it's like that one shoots like a wave of like arcane energy out, right? So it's different. Like it functions differently. Like the build is still basically the same outside of that, though. So the majority of the build is not you just spamming like ranged attacks with the sword. It's you're using the weapon like a normal weapon until you use its special ability, right? Whereas with a miracle build, focuses heavily on the miracles, where you use those for healing instead of your actual healing items. Whenever you need health and whenever you need health from going from A to B. Whereas for something more aggressive like a strength build, you're using that big ass weapon all the time, right? And you're using it as a big ass weapon all the time. Where you're breaking poise, smashing the fuck out of people, pancaking dudes. The builds are differentiated because you use those things often when playing with the build, right? And that's part of the reason why they're called builds. Just because we have one item that lets you do something weird doesn't mean the entire build is built around that one item, right? You can do that, but that doesn't mean that using it once makes your entire build change. DS1 to 3 is called Moonlight Greatsword. Bloodborne's called Holy Moonlight Sword. Yes. Thank you, Sheep. I keep forgetting which sword of the moon they keep doing. But just like this is I think the root of the issue here is that he's drawing a different line in terms of how you compare builds, and I'm drawing a different one. Like, I'm drawing in terms of how functionally they change, whereas he's saying, it seems like he's saying it's more of an aesthetic thing in terms of how you choose to use your weapon, as opposed to like what actual differences happen as a result of your build being different. I play these games too much. You are preaching to the choir.
I'm specifically making a distinction on these grounds rather than just paying the difference is that in its current state, for Bloodborne to have more builds, it'd need more weapons, and the parameters under which the weapons are designed around have very few avenues left to be explored. But for Bloodborne to have more choices within a build, all that is needed is more ways to fine-tune things. Stuff like Carol runes and blood gems already go a long way here, but the ability to, say, make a weapon righteous by using it a lot against Canehurst enemies, or have our blood tinge be buffable by injecting ourselves with some sort of special blood at the cost of our enemy rallying much more and having their beast pellet meters fill faster, would also facilitate this. Things like taking extra damage from would enemy will buy it a
I
lot
gotta get that clip
to,
back.
and blood gems already go a long
I
way
got
here.
distracted by his lightning
But
sword.
the ability to, say, make a weapon righteous by using it a lot against Canehurst enemies, or have our blood tinge be buffable by injecting ourselves with some sort of special blood at the cost of our enemy rallying much more and having their beast pellet meters fill faster, would also facilitate this. Things like taking extra damage from righteous weapons in online if you're a vile blood, and letting players play more with the hands-off stats like Frenzy could also add a bit of added decision making, specifically to online. Not that Bloodborne as is lacking for choice when it comes to combat. Sure, it has fewer weapons than Dark Souls, but most weapons in Dark Souls are trash anyways, which no one uses.
Wow, it's just shitting all over Dark Souls 1. It's like most weapons in Dark Souls 1 are trash anyway. I mean, the only weapons that I think are objectively provable to be trash would be the broken straight sword. That's the only weapon that is legitimately provably trash because it's minute damage. Everything else is build specific. And you can upgrade them. Like you can beat the game with any weapon, even your fists. Right? But it's like there are certain weapons that are obviously like going to be stronger than others, but that doesn't mean that all the other weapons are shit as a result of it. Man, that is such a fuck you to all the Dark Souls players right there with what he just said. Let's hear it again.
When it comes to combat, sure, it has fewer weapons than Dark Souls, but most weapons in Dark Souls are trash anyways, which no one uses. So even though there's technically speaking fewer builds in Bloodborne, it's a trade-off of variety in favor of quality.
And this is one thing. I would not say this is a trade-off in variety versus quality. I would say this is a trade-off where instead of going for variety, they go for refinement and focus. And the reason I'm saying it that way is because you might think I'm making the same point he is, but I'm making it slightly differently because when you focus on a game like this, where you make things a little bit more focused in terms of the builds, right? When you focus more on trick weapons and parrying, that lets you go a lot deeper in terms of how you can use them, how often you can use them, and the mechanics that are built around using those things. Whereas, in Dark Souls, there's so much variety that sometimes that variety can come back to bite you in the ass. For example, if you're a pyromancer, you might have a really good time going through the Duke's Archives or Tomb of the Giants, but you're going to have a hard time going through Lost Izalith. Similar thing with magic users when going through the Duke's Archives is like those enemies are resistant to magic. That's part of the charm of the game, is that every build has a weak point in the game to a certain extent, where they're going to need to have to work around something that their build is not built to accommodate for. The thing with Bloodborne, though, is that most things have a very simple switcheroo in terms of how they make things work. Like you can easily not enchant, but actually, I don't know what's the term for applying bolt paper to your weapon and all those other effects. I don't know what those are off the top of my head. But all of those, all of those can be applied in an instant, and then they, are gone after a little bit, right? Like, so you can kind of mix and match things based on whatever you need. Yeah, certain weapons work better depending on your build, which you have a great choice. Yeah, it's like, well, that's the thing is, this is one thing that I think is actually a strength of Bloodborne is because they don't have that many builds. They focus more on the weapons in terms of how you want to use them, which I think is a point he could make to make a case for Bloodborne's lack of builds. It's like, instead of getting more builds, we got deeper weapons, which the trick weapons are deeper than most weapons in Dark Souls 1, right? And I think that's a pretty good comparison. And I think that it's favorable of Bloodborne, but is also fair to Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne at the same time. It's just, and like you said, Sheep, it does seem like it seems like he's making a point where he's crapping on Dark Souls 1 to try to make Bloodborne look better when you end up making both of them look worse. It's like there are a lot of things to commend about Bloodborne and Dark Souls for different reasons. Just you have to do it. Just acknowledge the problems and you can, move on to the things that are actually good. It also works in ensuring that everyone is having a similar experience rather than, one build having a way easier time than another. Yeah, and that's a point he could make, is that with this focus, you can craft a encounter where very few people are going to have a time where they can just blitz through the area because their build's overpowered. Like one common complaint of sorcery in, Demon Souls and some of the earlier Souls games are just that they are fucking broken when you have a bunch of casts, right? Just spamming dudes from far away. So some of the games didn't even require stamina when you did it. It's like magic was overpowered. Later on they found ways to sort of balance it, but then they made enemies ridiculous where they dodge your shit over and over, which is incredibly annoying. But like the point still stands. It's like magic was overpowered, so they tried to like balance it in some way. And I think Dark Souls 3 actually did a pretty good job of balancing it with the Estus flipping back and forth between the red and the blue. Yeah, it's like Moonlight Butterfly is very easy or tedious depending on what your build is, and it's like, and you brought up a good point. It's like if you have ranged against the Moonlight Butterfly, the fight becomes way faster and much easier, especially if you've got like some decent range damage, whether it be from, pyromancy, miracles, or even sorcery against it. Like just any range at all will radically change that fight. Yeah, maybe you also keep your Estus intact. Never had to split them. Yeah, I mean, just there's a lot of things that you could praise about Bloodborne, and that you could talk about Bloodborne as like a really cool step forward. I think one problem that a lot of people in this community have is sort of they need to validate their favorite game as the best one. It seems like I've seen this with a lot of different people. Where they take something they like a lot and then find any way they can to justify it being the best, when a lot of times it's not. And sometimes like it's got a lot of great stuff in it, but overall it's like they make a bunch of good points and then they invalidate those good points by making a bunch of really stupid, biased, shitty points that make them look like a biased, dickhead that doesn't actually want to add anything to the discussion. They just want to gush about the game they like, and they want to shit on the game they don't like, right? That's the one thing, is like you're free to do, to shit on things you hate and praise things you like, but to unnecessarily shit on things to make something, look better, you're not making it look better. All right, you're making it look like you don't have an argument, right? And it's a thing where it's the packaging of it too. It's like him saying earlier that like Dark Souls 1 weapons, most of them suck. It's like that's such an underhanded way of shitting on Dark Souls 1, implying that Bloodborne system is so much better. Is like, I bet that there are more weapons that are useful in Dark Souls 1 than in Bloodborne. And you want to know why? It's because most of them are useful if you use them correctly. Yes, it's like, I hate that. These games were made by the same people. Why are you trying so hard to put your game above all the others? It's like, yeah, it's like, just because you like a game doesn't mean it's perfect. Just because you hate a game doesn't mean it's complete shit. I'm like, I've criticized the hell out of Dark Souls 2. I still have a blast playing it, but it has problems, and we should acknowledge those problems. Anyway, see, how much more do we have to go through this section? I'm trying to end on like the ends of sections because I've got to go.
Every weapon in Bloodborne is viable and interesting to experiment with if you're creative enough. Every weapon in Dark Souls, not so much.
Again, he's doing the shitting on Dark Souls thing when it's like, dude, Dark Souls weapons function well in the game because the game has a bunch of simple things that the weapons are built to do. The small weapons are meant to be fast, so they're useful when you need little fast strikes because your build can't handle the super heavy weapons. By the time you finish this, the summer's going to kick in. Probably. I mean, fucking hell. Like 2 hours on this? We made it like 24 minutes into it or something? It's going to be forever. But we're getting there.
What seems to be at the core of this conversation is the sequence in which builds open up to the players in this game. In Dark Souls, every build was open from the get-go, and the player's journey was largely about optimizing it, finding better spells for sorcerers, unlocking pyromancies for pyromancers. You get the idea. And since that game's beginning was so incredibly flexible, the player could be 80% of the way done with their build before even going into Sen's Fortress. Demon's Souls is still the reigning champion in this regard, if you ask me, since it quite literally has 5 things for the player to do at any time in the early game, and the build variety on offer which that setup enabled is hard to match. Bloodborne, being a more linear package, might be where this issue is rooted because the builds are so based on the weapons used, and when a weapon unlocks near the end, it requires the player to replay the entire game for them to experience that build.
Yeah, this is one thing too that I've noticed is like I think it's a thing where we're just fundamentally arguing about different things. It's like like our definition of a build is different than his definition of a build, and I think that last little bit he just said sums it up, where he basically pointed it out that every weapon is its own build, and it's like not as we define it. Like that's not how we're defining builds. Like we're defining builds as things that fight differently, things that make you experience the game differently because you're using a different build, right? Things that functionally change how combat works. It's not just instead of hitting them with an axe, I now hit them with a saw cleaver, or I hit them with the cane, or I hit them with a stick, right? It doesn't like it's your build doesn't change that much. Is it really a build, right? You know, like is it really a build shift? Like, do you actually change builds if you go from hitting them with one weapon to hitting them with a different weapon? Is that actually a build change, or is it just a weapon change? Right, and this is the thing where it falls back into itself, where even if he does say this, if he qualifies it by saying that weapons are different builds, then every other game has more builds than this game because there's only like 15 like weapons in Bloodborne, right? Whereas every other Souls game has like 60, right? So even by his own metric, he is fucking his argument over. It's like, oh my god, dude, why? Why? I can kind of see where he's coming from, but the stat requirements are so low in Bloodborne that you could dead ass use anything before ROM. I mean, I think that's pretty true. I mean, I think the biggest problem with Bloodborne's, or not the biggest problem, but like the biggest challenge in terms of getting a weapon to work in Bloodborne is just finding them. It's more about finding them than actually getting your stats up. You know, it's not like Dark Souls 1, where you could find like a Black Knight weapon or like a really great weapon early, and then you have to level up your stats a good bit to actually be able to use it. You know, it's like in Bloodborne, you find a good bit of weapons, and it's probably that pretty simple to get those stats up. There are so few weapons in this game that there are trophies for getting all the weapons, man. Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like he's making an argument that kind of folds in on itself. It's a thing where I think it might be a point just to kind of breeze through anytime he talks about this, because he's arguing from a completely different point than we are. and that means that the rest of this video is going to have that sort of logic going through it the whole time. If he's consistent. I don't know if he's going to backtrack on it later on or not, but we'll see.
As a Burial Blade and Bloodletter fan, I know this pain all too well. Of course, a bit of online searching will reveal which chalice dungeons make the player's desired weapons available, but considering you can't do the searchable chalices until you've finished the first one, It's not as if builds are accessible from the get-go. And the searchable chalices are also locked behind Sony's online subscription, so it sort of feels like there's a running tax on playing the game your own way.
Hey, that's a great criticism of Bloodborne right there that he just said. Let's get that full thing in its full glory. Just to
One, it's not as if builds are accessible from the get-go. And the searchable chalices are also locked behind Sony's online subscription, so it sort of feels like there's a running tax on playing the game your own way.
man, it's one of those things where you could actually make a not a perfect, but a decent argument that Bloodborne could be considered pay to win if you have the online setup. Yeah, that PlayStation Plus paywall shit for the chalices is another reason to just say fuck them. It's another reason just to say fuck them. Yeah, I mean, that might actually be one of the biggest fuck you moments of any From Software game now that I think about it, because every other game functions on its own, right? Like you have to buy DLC if you want DLC shit, but that's pretty fair, but being able to use an entire system in the game based on a subscription service, like that's fucking stupid. Like talk about nickel and diming.
Had Bloodborne been more sequence shiftable, that is, had players been able to construct their own path through the world more, this likely would not be as sore of an issue as it is. A hypothetical sequel would hopefully have the good sense not to lock so many of the builds behind bosses you can't access until there's nothing left of the game. If player expression is made heavily dependent on their chosen weapon, then players are going to feel a real lack of choice when the best stuff is kept away from them for a long time. A potential solution might be to make every weapon choosable in the beginning on the condition that the player had already beat the game once already. That way, they'd have the experience which Miyazaki intended their first time through, and for their second build, when they actually know what they are doing, they can be a bit more expressive without having to pay for Sony's online subscription.
It's like a mobile game trope where you deal with the random drops doing the regular chalices, but get what you need online. Yeah, it's just, I mean, it really is just kind of like a fucked system. I mean, you can actually say it's pay to win because the cum chalice, like the cum chalice, like gives you an exorbitant amount of runes, or not runes, of blood echoes available, and it's like it's basically a subscription service to free levels, and it's like that's the biggest imbalancer of this game. Dark Souls 2 was bad to re-release Dark Souls 2. Scholar with minute changes and charge you for a new game, but that subscription thing is probably way worse. Probably way worse. I mean, imagine how many people wasted money on that thing just to use online and like chalices. Let's see, let's say you want the Whirligig Saw after beating the game, you wouldn't have the stats to wield it. Yeah, what he said about the weapons and being kind of spawned at the beginning. I think that's something that really, I think the weapons in Bloodborne should be balanced better. And I think they should have different tiers of weapons, right? Like when it comes to like heavy weapons in like the other games, right, beforehand, in Dark Souls 1, you could get a heavier version of a weapon, right? Like the Zweihander is a good example of a big sword that you can get that's pretty heavy hitting, right? But then you can make it up to like a Black Knight sword, then you might make it up to like the Great Sword, then you might make it up to the Black Knight Ultra Great Sword. It's like there are tiers within the heavy weapon category, just like all the other ones. Yeah. But I mean, I think it's a thing where just, if they tiered the weapons in Bloodborne better, I think you could actually make an argument for putting weapons later on in the game. But I think it's a thing where it's just kind of mixed and kind of messed up right now in terms of like where all the weapons are placed, in terms of, is this a good place to place it for people that want it, and also for balancing purposes. I think there's a lot of components that you need to account for when putting weapons in certain places. I have to manually disable Wi-Fi to play Scholar. Yeah, that's one thing I hated about Dark Souls 2 as well. It was just the insistence on being online is like just annoying. Yeah, and that's another good point is like, things do get boring when all the weapons are almost equal in terms of what, how much damage they do. The difference really just comes in the move sets. Now it can be fun to play the game with different weapons based on kind of how they work. And some move sets are better than others in terms of certain situations, but it does get very monotonous when it becomes like, okay, this is where I'm going to use the hunter axe in its trick form. This is where I'm going to use the regular saw cleaver. And it's one of those things where I feel like it kind of hinders the gameplay in a way because you're checking out weapons that you may not even like necessarily want to keep, but they're better for this encounter. It would be like switching, well, by his argument, it would be like switching builds every time that you find an encounter where one weapon is better against something than another. It's like that would be kind of annoying. Got invaded in front of him on. I took off all my armor out of fear that he had asked, and then jumped off to my death. Yeah. Well, this is one thing is that I've done a lot, and anytime I get invaded, is I just kill myself immediately, right? Or run to the boss door if it's close. Like I just ignore shit, or I just let him kill me. Like I'm not putting up a fight. If you want my souls, fucking take them, dude. I'll come back and get them later. I'm here for the game, not your laggy backstabs. Anyway.
In other words, the game can be somewhat improved by Sony not making as much money. So it's probably not going to happen. I thought that guy had fallen off the bridge. Luckily, he didn't kick me down. The Nightmare Frontier is one of the best areas to reach on any playthrough because it's got a lot of wandering nightmares which drop relatively good upgrade materials that can set you well up for the areas to come. We also have crawlers here who drop cold blood, and there are also winter lanterns, the frenzy-inducing enemies, which like to drop some pretty good blood gems. That being said, story-wise, I think this is the least important area in the entire game. I mean, sure, in a meta sense, it's where we get tricked by patches, which, that's an important part of from soft games, but relating solely to Bloodborne, this might be the least important area. This or Hemwick. That being said, I go here much more often than I do, say, Canehurst, which might just go to show how going through games is often more about systemic progression, in this case getting good resources, than it is story progression. In the case of Canehurst, uncovering the story of the executioners and the Vile Bloods. The Nightmare Frontier is almost devoid of story, which relates to the main narrative. Canehurst is almost devoid of resources, which you'll be using in your playthrough. Whichever you visit more might have to do with which of these are more important to you. I was floored the first time I went to Canehurst, but after learning about it, its oomph isn't that big of a draw for me anymore. I'll be running through a lot of the areas to come because they like to deal status ailment damage to me, and some of them have enemies who like to throw giant boulders with unpredictable hitboxes at me. Note in the case of the boulder throwing enemies that the area trap is attached to enemies so that players are able to rally in case they get hit. Since there's not a lot of action for the next few minutes, I think this is a good place to talk about lore.
Random thought, but I do wish the parries had a bit more armor because I get the riposte, but I get sent flying from one hit, wasting the parry. Yeah. Michael Zaki from the Bloodborne Poison Swamp. He put it in an optional area, so someone must have been breathing down his neck. Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a thing where, like, when you look at what Miyazaki is able to make when he doesn't have like studio oversight or something going on, he puts them in sort of a mandatory area to some degree, right? And later on, like when he's told not to do it, he doesn't do it sometimes, you know. That is kind of a funny thing to notice, though. Is like, he really does love poison swamps, but I'm kind of okay with him making them optional in certain places. They did get better as they went along, though. They weren't as intrusive as some areas were. Now, obviously, there are still going to be just absolutely cancerous areas that just suck. I'm looking at the Rot Lake in Elden Ring. Fuck that place. But they can get a little better as they go, or at least we become more used to them.
We were brought into the Nightmare Frontier by the amygdala because we had the tonsil stone we got from patches in our inventory. So it makes sense to talk a bit about those guys first. There seems to be a cut subplot in the game relating to spiders. This is one of those pieces of cut content which was seemingly cut for creative reasons rather than technological ones, so consider the following conversation to be spurned by novelty other than need for lore. The idea was...
Yeah, I mean, the Lake of Rot looks cool, but that effect wears off after about 5 seconds of walking through it. it's like, yeah, it's like Melania looks good. Then you fight her and you're like, fuck, I'm gonna go somewhere else. But I mean, it's that thing where it's like there's a good way to do a poison swamp, and then there's a bad way to do a poison swamp. And then you get like a Lake of Rot where you're like, this is a really bad way to make really bad way to make a lake of status effect.
With the spiders.
Now I think about it, there's probably going to be a pit of death in probably the DLC of Elden Ring where it's just the death blight everywhere, just every fucking where, and you have to get across somehow. And at the very end of it, you'll get like a rune that gives you like 200 runes. It'll be absolutely a waste of time and just put there to fuck with players. I bet it'll happen.
Seems to...
I'll never understand what the thought process was in Waterfowl. I'm not that terrible at Souls games, but can you even dodge it normally? That's the thing, is like, it's one thing that I don't like about Elden Ring is how it changed the dodging mechanic where when you're in a light load, you roll farther. And I really don't like that. Nearly 10 minutes of progress in the half hour since I lost my signal. Yeah, this is... Yeah, we're slowly getting there, Andrew. But yeah, going back to the waterfowl thing, you can dodge it. You have to dodge in a specific direction with a light equip load at the right time, and you'll avoid it. I think the last waterfowl she does, I think is you can't dodge it the same way though. Like I think they're each different. You can look it up on like one of the wikis. I'm sure they've got it listed there because that's where I learned of it. And so it is possible to do, but if you get caught out, you're basically going to fucking die, which I think kind of negates any ability to dodge that thing. You know, if you screw up a combo and then you get killed for it, I think that's kind of unfair. It sliced the roll distance in half from DS3, it felt like, but I forced it to maintain my fashion. If there's one thing I've learned from Souls games is fashion is more important than survival. And we will keep fighting for that fashion until we die over and over.
Be that they were a sort of bridge between humans and the Great Ones. This is still somewhat represented in-game with the human-headed spiders and Ram, but the extent to which this was cut is really remarkable. First of all, amygdalas all have 8 regular limbs and 1 seemingly magical hand, with spidery hair follicles, and clinging to buildings like they do, they give the impression of spiders. That's what people initially thought they were when they were seen in trailers and in the open beta. The wet nurse boss fight seems to also be a vestigial element from that story. It has 8 arms, and probably used to be located in a cut area from Yosefka's clinic, and its name was the Demon of Darkness and Death. We have another cut piece of content in a character model of an old hag in clothing reminiscent of the wet nurse, so it seems like Yosefka's clinic was a place where experiments were being done to elevate humans to great ones. I mean, that's still kind of what Josef.
Yeah, sorry, Sheep. I don't think we're going to make it to ROM until like next time. Actually, we may not even make it to ROM by next time. That's like another 40 minutes. Might be the weekend after that. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm trying to get through this one section right now, but it's just taking forever. It's a good thing he's talking about lore, because from there I don't really have much to say.
Josefka's clinic is, but in the case of the cut story, the experiments had to do with spiders bridging the gap. Specifically, though, I theorized that the human-headed spiders were originally supposed to be attempts at creating amygdalas, but later got repurposed as development went on. As is, they don't really make any concrete sense in the world. But the amygdalas themselves kinda do. In Japanese, their name is amendos, which is supposed to be read as almonds. And the name amygdala comes from the Latin translation of almond. And although it is localization, that name might give us a better explanation to its purpose. The name almond simply refers to the shape of its head.
I gotta highlight this just because it's funny. We are not gonna make it. Watching your cursor slowly drift to Bergenworth filled me with hopelessness. I know, we are doomed to rummage through this nightmare for a long time. But next Saturday, we'll see how far we get. But that'll be a pre-recording, so I won't be interacting with chat. I got a wedding to go to, so I'll be busy. But hopefully the week after that, I actually might be able to go to ROM and actually like talk about it. So we'll see.
But the amygdala is a part of the limbic system, which is thought to be responsible for learning and organizing fear responses. That is, it seems like it is connected to our ability to form memories which relate to fear. The amygdalas in Bloodborne seem to be some kinds of cosmic vagabonds who are drawn to eldritch happenings, and they have the power to open gates between dreams and reality if the player has an appropriate key to the dream in question.
I appreciate you being there for the pre-recording. I will appreciate that a lot. It's gonna be probably a little bit more boring, but we're gonna make it work. I'm mainly pre-record. Like, I don't plan to pre-record things unless it's a super long video like this that I kind of need to get out of the way before I do something else. So we'll see how far we get. Actually, for all I know, I could pre-record a super long video and just get through a lot of stuff. Been there from the start, not giving up. I appreciate it, Andrew. I appreciate it.
So for the Nightmare Frontier, this is the tonsil stone we got from Patches. Fun fact, tonsil seems to translate to amygdala in some languages. And for the Hunter's Nightmare later on, this will be the eye of a blood-drunk hunter. What?
Yeah, I want ROM to be live. I would like for ROM to be live, so I might make it a point to... Let's see, how long is this Forbidden Woods section? That's like... Well, that's a good bit. That's like, what, 34 to like almost 60? Almost an hour? That's almost half an hour just in Forbidden Woods. So we might have to come back to that. I've sat there and watched your entire Dark Souls 2 commentary. Thank you. It takes something special to bore me. I appreciate it. This will be a lot more lively than that, but yeah, I'm probably gonna cut it off here actually, just because I gotta go do stuff in real life, and I think I will make it a point to, in the pre-recording, we're gonna finish up the Nightmare Frontier and get through Forbidden Woods, and then I will stop before we get to Bergenworth, because I know people want to talk about ROM. And I know I want to talk about ROM. So we're going to talk about ROM when the time comes. But I'm going to have to end this here. But I appreciate you guys for hanging out. It's always fun. Always fun having you guys on this journey for me. If you have any other like recommendations for other Souls content you want me to react to, I don't have a system for it. But if you want to leave like a comment on the stream with a link to the video, I will look at it and watch it. I normally take these videos down and re-upload them on the ESAS archive, but I think I might just unlist them going forward just because that's easier and also lets people keep the stream up that they liked instead of it disappearing and reappearing somewhere else. So we'll see how that goes. But Yeah, I'd just like to thank you all for watching this wonderful stream, going over this game and this incredible video. And yeah, I just like to thank you all for watching once again, and I will see you guys. Ooh, H-Bomb Dark Souls 2 defense video. Ooh, I might do it. I don't know. Mahler already covered that video to death. I mean, and he did a fantastic job, and I don't think I could one up that. So I probably won't do it just because his video series is way better. Plus it's scripted and thought out, and there's actually some effort put in. So I probably won't do that, but I might check out some more Souls analyses videos as it goes on. But like I said, just this is one thing. You can leave as many comments as you want with as many links as you want. So if you throw them out there, I will think about them and I will mention them. But yeah, I just like to thank you all for watching. I will see you guys later.